Hello, fellow Sapiens. A quiet welcome to Midnight Sapien. Whether you're tucked into bed, under a quilt of starlight, driving home through the hush of a sleeping city, or simply craving a slow story to settle the mind, this space is for you. Because tonight, we're following the paw prints of a mystery: how cats came to curl beside us in the dark. This is a slow history for thoughtful minds. In a forgotten chapter of human life, the story of cats begins not in palaces or pet stores, but around ancient fires 10,000 years ago, where silence met hunger and eyes watched from the tall grass. But it's not the tale you might expect. It's not about taming a wild thing, but about being chosen by one. Oh, and if you're the kind of curious wanderer who enjoys slow journeys through deep time, consider tapping like and subscribe. That simple act helps this strange little channel reach more night-bound sapiens like you. And now I wonder, where are you listening from? What time is it where you are? If you feel like sharing, drop it in the comments. It's a small way to remind ourselves that, across this web of time zones, we're drifting together. By the way, if you're fading into sleep, that's perfectly okay. Timestamps are in the description, should you ever wish to return. And now, we begin with a pair of glowing eyes, watching from the edge of the wheat. The grass whispered before it bent. In the dim hush of dusk, just beyond the circle of firelight, a shape waited. Still, breath held, ears flicking to the sound of life unfolding in the clearing, the smell of roasted grain, the crunch of dry husks beneath a child's foot, and somewhere inside a woven basket, the frantic rustle of something small trying not to be found. The cat does not move. Not yet. Around 10,000 years before the present, long before the first cities, the Fertile Crescent was becoming something new. Stretching from the eastern edge of the Mediterranean to the Tigris and Euphrates, this crescent of land was lush in a way that mattered. It bore the right seeds, the right rain, the right timing, and it cradled a people whose way of life was on the edge of changing forever. These were the Natufians. They left no written stories, but the stones remember their habits. Hearth circles, mortars sunk into bedrock, the outlines of dwellings that suggest a rhythm of return, season after season. They were not quite farmers, but they were not fully foragers either. They harvested wild cereals. They hunted gazelle. They buried their dead close to home. And perhaps, most importantly of all, they began to stay. With staying came storage, and with storage came trouble. Grain, kept in woven baskets or shallow pits, attracted rodents in droves. Mice found a niche in this new human world and adapted rapidly. Their populations surged. Their hunger knew no pause. The quiet corners of Natufian dwellings echoed at night, with the sound of soft feet and gnawing teeth. And it was in these corners between bone tools and sleeping mats that something else crept in. Felis libica, the African wildcat, small, solitary, and perfectly adapted to stalking rodents in dry grasslands. This feline found something unexpected in the scattered settlements of the Natufians. Abundance, not just of prey, but of safety, of warmth, of leftover fish bones, crusts of dried barley, and the soft churn of human waste behind the huts. We cannot say for certain when the first wildcat stepped across the boundary between wilderness and village. No fossil records capture the exact moment. No cave art reveals the turning of its head. But if we allow the rhythm of the ecosystem to speak, the sequence feels almost inevitable. Humans gather grain. Mice follow. Cats follow mice. At first, they would have remained unseen, silent, watching from the brush, entering the darkened edges of camps after dusk. The people may not have noticed, or they may have noticed, but not minded. Or perhaps they watched back. A pair of eyes reflected firelight, and then vanished. If the Natufians saw the wildcats at all, they likely said nothing. Or, if they did speak of them, their words have long since vanished into dust. We have no surviving myths, no depictions scratched into stone. But absence is not silence. A story can move without leaving a mark, especially when it walks on quiet feet. These were people accustomed to watching. Their lives depended on it. They tracked the faint indentations of hooves in the soil. They followed the seasonal return of plants and birds. They observed, remembered, and adapted. It is difficult to imagine they would not have noticed the presence of an unfamiliar predator moving at the margins of their homes. At the archaeological site of Ain Malaha, nestled in the Galilean hills of what is now northern Israel, the traces of Natufian life are particularly vivid. Semi-subterranean houses built in circular shapes, grinding stones worn smooth, midden heaps thick with fish bones, mollusk shells, charred seeds, and animal remains. This was not a temporary encampment. It was a place people returned to again and again, likely across generations, a place of routine and memory. And where humans repeat themselves, other species begin to listen. The rodents certainly did. Drawn by the smell of stored food and the relative safety of human settlements, they nested in walls, dug into floors, and reproduced rapidly. Their population growth left traces: tiny bones in trash heaps, gnaw marks on seeds, teeth marks etched into the record of prehistory. But where there are rodents, predators soon follow. Felis libica was not new to this game. It had stalked similar prey for millennia across Africa and the Near East. It was a solitary hunter, lean-bodied and sharp-eyed, built for dry brush and ambushes beneath moonlight. Its instincts were already aligned with this new opportunity. What changed was proximity. The wildcat now found itself in a world of walls, of fire pits, of places where rodents gathered in numbers never before encountered in the wild. And humans so dangerous to many species seemed strangely uninterested in driving the cats away. The boundaries between them held steady, neither threatened, neither tamed. A standoff made of silence. Some archaeologists describe this phase not as domestication, but as commensalism, a biological relationship in which one species benefits while the other is unaffected. The cats gained a stable food source. The humans, perhaps unknowingly, gained a form of pest control. There were no leashes, no names, no contact, only a shared space, cautiously negotiated through time. We do not know how many generations passed in this fragile balance. But the seed had been planted, not in the soil, but in the structure of daily life. A small carnivore had begun to fold itself into the edge of human settlement, not as a servant, not as a god, but as a presence, unasked for, uninvited, and, perhaps, not unwelcome. In the hush between footsteps, before dawn pulled mist from the grass, a cat crouched beneath a basket. The humans slept. The mice did not, and something ancient was playing out in miniature, beneath the skin of a changing world. At some point, though, we cannot say exactly when a threshold was crossed. Not by force, not by design, but by quiet repetition. The wildcats that lingered near Natufian settlements weren't simply passing through. They stayed. Generation after generation, they returned to the same places, slipping between stones and shadows, growing less wary, more observant, and perhaps more familiar. In time, a subtle pressure began to shape their fate. Natural selection does not require intention. It only requires conditions, and the conditions were shifting. In villages where cats were tolerated, individuals who were bolder, who lingered longer, who bred closer to the human hearth, would have found more food, more shelter, more success. Over many lifespans, their traits accumulated. Not drastically, not overnight, but just enough to nudge the wild into something else. Fur patterns began to vary. Bones of ancient cats in these regions show slight differences from their wild ancestors. Shorter faces, smaller brains, more juvenile features. Changes that mirror those seen in other animals humans lived beside. But this was not the heavy hand of domestication seen in cattle or dogs. It was a soft fingerprint, a suggestion rather than a command. Still, not all wildcats became domestic. Most likely did not. The forests and scrublands beyond the villages still belonged to the feral and untouchable. The transformation was local, patchy, unfinished. And yet, for the first time in natural history, a feline was becoming something new, not merely a hunter, but a cohabitant. And what of the humans? They were changing too. From foragers to farmers, from wanderers to residents of soil and stone. They began shaping land to their needs, fencing, digging, planting. As their footprint grew, so too did the invitation it sent to opportunists, to scavengers, to survivors. And among those, the cat had found a niche uniquely suited to its gifts. No artifact tells us what the Natufians thought of these animals. There is no sculpture, no deliberate burial of a cat from this period has yet been found. And yet, their absence from the record may be telling. They were not livestock, not gods, not tools. They were something quieter, something woven into the ordinary, a flicker at the edge of a torch's glow. It may have started with a stare across the fire. A glance returned. No threat, no reward, just recognition. And then, with time, the smallest of decisions, one species choosing not to run, the other choosing not to strike, would ripple forward, until the cat no longer waited in the grass, but walked, silently, through the spaces we made for ourselves, and stayed. The spaces humans carved into the world began to pulse with new rhythms, and the presence once lurking at the edges moved inward, following more than just instinct. What happens when surplus shifts the balance of nature? The answer begins with grain. Not just the gathering of it, but the keeping. At first, it was simple: a few bundles of wild barley, or emmer wheat, stored in baskets lined with woven reeds, tucked beside hearths or sunken into the coolness of packed earth. These caches were meant to stretch through dry spells, to feed the child who cried too early in the season, or the elder too frail to forage. But abundance does not rest quietly. It spreads, it accumulates, and with each season that the Natufians returned to the same settlements, the stores grew heavier, deeper, more central to their survival. With surplus came consequence. Rodents were the first to answer, especially Mus musculus domesticus, the house mouse. A species of remarkable resilience and adaptability, it slipped easily into this new ecological puzzle. Where humans stored food, the mouse followed. It nested in thatch, burrowed through basketry, and darted between stones with a speed that outpaced any trap. In archaeological strata from early settlements like Ain Malahar and Jericho, the bones of mice lie buried in quantity, often with clear signs of gnawing on grain, suggesting a population well entrenched in human life. But rodents were not the only ones listening to the rustle of grain. Felis libica, the African wildcat, did not need an invitation. It came not for humans, but for what followed them, the mice, the scurrying, trembling, high-pitched prey that now clustered not in open fields but beneath the baskets and refuse piles of villages. The wildcat, already finely attuned to dry terrain and small mammals, found in this arrangement something close to abundance. Here, the landscape was compressed. The hunt no longer required wide movement or patient tracking through brittle scrub. A single granary or trash heap might hold a dozen meals. One corner of a food pit could echo with enough movement to justify hours of stillness. And while humans stood nearby, while fires burned, the cats began to adjust, not taming themselves, but tuning themselves to the frequency of human rhythm. Did the Natufians notice? We cannot be certain. No cave walls show a wildcat crouched beside a hearth. No beads spell out its name. But we know they watched the world closely. They observed gazelle tracks with care. They understood how plants bent in the wind. It is unlikely the wildcat went entirely unseen. What began here was not a relationship of affection, but of overlap. One species produced scraps, the other cleaned them. And in that accidental choreography, the first steps of commensal life took root. Not in cages, not in myth, but in the echo of paws beneath woven floor mats. That soft echo, too small to wake a sleeping child, threaded itself into the architecture of daily life. In settlements like Ain Malaha, the walls tell a quiet story. Circular houses dug partially into the ground, stones fitted together with care, topped by roofs of reeds and brush. Inside, hearths are set in the centre, with food remains tucked along the edges. Bone tools rest beside grinding stones, their surfaces smoothed by years of use, and tucked into the layers of ash and soil, hidden from the living, lie the bones of mice. There are so many. At first glance, it seems a minor detail. But the sheer number of tiny rodent remains across Natufian sites signals something fundamental. This was not a passing infestation. It was an ecological occupation. Rodents thrived in human spaces, not as pests in the modern sense, but as inevitable residents of a system built on storage. Granaries, garbage piles, and hearthside crumbs created permanent niches where small animals multiplied in rhythm with the harvest. And wherever the mouse settled, the cat followed. For the wildcat, this was a new kind of hunting ground, one where the prey was less scattered, less wary, and far more numerous. The cat's approach changed. Less distance, more crouching, more waiting. Piles of discarded food scraps, fish bones, lentil husks, charred barley drew mice in, and behind them, the cats arrived like living shadows. At the nearby site of Jericho, later layers reveal more advanced forms of storage. Rectangular buildings appear, with compartments that may have been used to hold grain. The walls grow thicker. The doors become more defined. These are the blueprints of permanence. And within those plans, once again, the evidence of rodents returns. Teeth marks, burrows, bones, still no collars, still no leashes, just footprints in ash. There is no clear moment when the relationship between humans and cats became something more than coincidence. But there is evidence of growing proximity. A few wildcat remains from the Neolithic period, found near human dwellings, suggest animals that died not far from where people slept. The distinction between tolerated hunter and unwelcome intruder was likely fluid. Some were driven off, others ignored, and a few, perhaps, allowed to stay. Ecologists call this a commensal relationship. One species benefits, the other remains unaffected. But in reality, the lines blur. Fewer rodents meant less spoiled grain, less disease, less damage. The wildcat, simply by being present, served a role in maintaining the stability of this early food economy, and the cat required so little in return. It asked for no training, no fence, no praise. It came for its own reasons, stayed on its own terms, and left if those terms were violated. The wildcat was not a servant, it was an opportunist, a specialist adapting to a new frontier carved by human hands and filled with a new kind of prey. And somewhere between the baskets and bones, it began to linger longer. Longer stays meant deeper changes not just in the cat, but in the space between species. It was not yet companionship. It was not trust. But it was consistency. The wildcat returned to the same places, generation after generation, and in doing so, became something slightly different than its untamed cousins beyond the scrub. It was still cautious, still solitary, but perhaps more observant, more attuned to human movement, less quick to vanish at the sound of a footfall. And most importantly, it learned that human presence did not always mean danger. Some of this change may have come from pressure as simple as survival. In settlements where cats were ignored or allowed to stay, the bolder ones thrived. They ate more, they bred more. They passed on the traits that helped them endure among people. Natural selection, quiet and unseen, nudged them toward a form not yet domestic, but not fully wild. It happened without intention, without awareness, just a slow tilt toward coexistence. In this way, early villages like Ain Malahar and Jericho became more than shelters or food stores. They became ecological experiments, accidental arenas where the rules of wild behavior began to shift under new pressures. The rhythm of human life altered the animal world around it, not through force, but through presence. Trash heaps became habitats. Grain stores became feeding grounds. Human settlements became ecosystems. And the cat, drawn by hunger, found more than food. It found a role. The rodent population boom created an opening. The surplus of stored grain made early villages targets for infestation. Mice and rats, quick to breed and skilled at slipping through barriers, became permanent residents. They undermined storage, spread disease, and contaminated supplies. They were not just a nuisance, they were a threat to survival. And yet, in this threat, a solution appeared on quiet paws. The wildcat did what it had always done, hunt. But now it hunted in a new environment, alongside a new neighbor. It asked nothing. It brought results. It kept no score. Over time, its presence became part of the equilibrium. Not domesticated, not welcomed, but not removed. This is the root of commensalism. Not mutual affection, but mutual tolerance. One species creates an environment rich in opportunity. The other exploits that opportunity while offering something in return. The balance is delicate, and it rarely lasts forever. But for a time it holds. The descendants of these cats would eventually follow the arc of human migration. As grain spread through Mesopotamia, into Anatolia and beyond, the cats followed. Not as cargo, not as pets, but as shadows moving just behind the flame. In the quiet before dawn, in the spaces behind the granary, the wildcat waited. The child slept, the rodent stirred, and something soft and striped moved in silence. The predator had not been tamed, but it had learned where to wait. It listened instead of announcing itself. It moved through the village like mist curling along the edges of habit. What, then, does it mean to live beside a creature, but never fully draw it in? This is the quiet paradox at the heart of early human-cat relationships. The evidence we find in ancient soils does not speak in absolutes. No carved figurines of feline deities. No names scrawled into clay. No collars or cages or marks of possession. And yet, something unmistakable took root. Archaeologists searching the Levant and surrounding regions have uncovered bones of Felis libica from within or near human settlements dated to the pre-pottery Neolithic. Some of these bones show patterns that hint at an unusual life. There are signs of survival into old age, healed fractures, worn but intact teeth, clues that suggest an animal who lingered close to safety, whose risks were less than those of its cousins in the open wild. Yet this safety came without full surrender. These cats were not fed from the hand. They were not bred in pens or moved across territories by human will. What we see, instead, is proximity without possession, coexistence without control. To understand just how unusual that is, we must place it in context. Most domestic animals, dogs, sheep, goats, underwent profound changes under human direction. Their diets, behaviors, even their skeletal structures shifted over time through deliberate intervention. But in cats, that shift is far more subtle. The earliest archaeological signs do not show rounded skulls or shortened snouts. They show wildcats, still bearing the sleek, angular shape of the predator. Their bodies do not seem engineered. They seem adapted, gently, by long exposure. And that exposure was uneven. Some sites show evidence of cats embedded in community life. In Cyprus, a burial dating to roughly 7500 BCE contains both a human and a cat, interred side by side. The positioning, while modest, suggests intentionality. A moment of symbolic or emotional weight, perhaps respect, perhaps remembrance, perhaps something softer we cannot name. Other sites show nothing at all. In many villages, the presence of the cat is inferred only through its absence from refuse piles that are otherwise rich with the bones of hunted or scavenged animals. The lack of feline remains may imply avoidance. Perhaps people did not eat cats. Perhaps they did not hunt them. Perhaps they held a quiet reverence for the animal that kept the mice away and asked for nothing in return. This uneven record leaves room for uncertainty, and it is in that space between clear data points that the most evocative questions take shape. What did it feel like to watch a cat emerge from the shadows of the granary at dusk? What meanings did the Natufians place on those slit eyes catching the light? What cannot be known, we can only imagine, carefully and slowly, with evidence as our guide. Guided by evidence and restraint, we can begin to trace a shape. Not of domestication, but of deepening tolerance. A quiet alignment of interests, slowly coalescing at the edge of the firelight. One of the more telling threads lies in toothwear. In zoo archaeology, even the smallest details matter. the surfaces of molars, the angles of canines, the faint grooves, striations, and polish that accumulate over time as an animal feeds. These are not random scars, they are a diary, a fossilized record of diet, behavior, and life lived. Wild Felis libica, when found far from settlements, typically show signs of a hard existence. Their teeth bear the trauma of cracked bones, torn sinew, and unyielding prey, grooved enamel, blunted tips, breaks that speak of hunger, pushing a creature beyond safety. But in cats discovered near Neolithic villages, the story is different. Wear is still present, but softened, less aggressive. There are fewer fractures, fewer signs of desperate chewing. What does this mean? It suggests a diet not of raw bone, but of softer prey. Small rodents caught in storerooms, scraps left behind in middens, perhaps even the leftovers of butchered livestock. The meals may not have been generous, they may not have been offered, but they were enough to ease the wear of life. This does not imply that humans were feeding cats from their hands. There is no archaeological evidence of deliberate provisioning, no storage containers filled with food meant for cats, but what the cats received, they took on their own terms. And that, too, was a kind of bond. The village became a landscape of opportunity. Grain stores pulsed with rodent activity. Garbage heaps steamed in the morning sun. Slaughter sites left entrails in the dust. These were not gifts. They were byproducts of human survival. But to the wildcat, they formed a patchwork of access, places where risk and reward coexisted, and where the price of proximity was less than the price of solitude. Still, the cat did not submit. It did not change overnight. The wildness remained. There are no signs of breeding programs, no pens, no confinement. The cat walked where it wanted. It came and went. It was tolerated, not trained. In this way, the relationship was fundamentally different from that of the dog. The dog was brought in, shaped, directed. Over time, it was assigned roles: guardian, hunter, companion. But the cat was never assigned. It was observed. Perhaps that observation gave it power. A creature that asks for nothing cannot be bribed. A creature that yields nothing cannot be broken. And in a world filled with animals yoked to plough or pen, the cat stood apart. Its utility lay in its distance. Its effectiveness came from what it did when no one was looking. And so, people let them stay. They did not name them, they did not leash them, but they left the door open. And the cat, never asking, simply walked in. The fire burned low, casting long shadows across packed earth and sleeping limbs. Outside, in the cold stillness, something shifted. Not closer, not farther, just there, watching. For thousands of years, this was the pattern. The cat hovered at the threshold, neither wild enough to flee, nor tame enough to claim. It lived in a state of almost, and that almost defined an entire phase of its relationship with humankind. There is no term in ancient tongues that names this liminal role, no word for the creature that shared space but not trust. But the signs endure in remains: scattered bones, shallow graves, unmarked but deliberate placements. Some cats were buried whole, as if their bodies mattered in death. Others were not discarded with refuse. That small difference means everything. In Ain Ghazal, a site rich with ritual and settlement layers, animal bones reveal subtle shifts. Certain cats, found near household structures, show signs of old injuries that had healed a broken paw, a crushed rib. These were not animals thriving on their own. They survived because they lingered near care, even if that care was unspoken, even if it came in the form of a sheltered wall or a hand that did not strike. To live close to people without being owned is rare in the history of animals. Most creatures that align with humans do so through pressure. They are shaped, selectively bred, coerced. But the cat retained its original blueprint. Its instincts held fast. It walked alone, even when it walked among us. And yet, something softened. We see this in art, though it appears rarely. Early human depictions of animals were often functional: ibex, gazelle, cattle. They represented food, danger, fertility. But when cats appear, they are usually alone. Sleek, unbound, never yoked, never fenced. Some are carved in profile, with arching backs and coiled tails. Others sit with the calm stillness known to anyone who has watched a cat watch the world. There is no evidence that the people who carved them thought of cats as symbols of power or gods. That would come later. But even here, in the simplest scratches on stone or clay, we sense a recognition. This animal did not serve, but it stayed. And staying, in the end, was enough to change the future. Not all cats remained close. Some reverted, some scattered. Not every village was a haven. Not every human a silent ally. The process was uneven, slow, and shaped by countless unrecorded choices. But the pattern deepened over time. Proximity bred familiarity, familiarity bred tolerance, and tolerance, slowest of all, became something like trust. By the end of this early chapter, the cat had become a fixture. Not yet a companion, not yet curled at the foot of a bed, but there, still, in the dust, on the threshold, watching the flame and the people who sat beside it. And in the silence, something old waited to become something new. The quiet grew longer, and the line between the watcher and the watched began to blur. Then, one day, someone dug into the earth, not to store grain, not to build a wall, but to make space for a body, and next to it, another, smaller, lighter, feline. On the southern edge of Cyprus, near a site now known as Shillourokambos, archaeologists uncovered a burial unlike anything seen before. It dates back more than 9,000 years. A human body laid with care, and beside it, a cat. Not a carving, not a shadow, a real one, bone to bone, life to life. The grave was simple, shallow. It held no elaborate goods or golden masks, just remains, nested in earth, together. The two bodies were not thrown, they were placed. That placement matters. It tells us the act was not an accident. It was a gesture, a choice, a moment captured in stillness and then forgotten by time, until time gave it back. The cat, according to osteological analysis, was not a wild island species. Its proportions, skull, and teeth pointed to Felis libica, the African wildcat, the same species that had haunted the granaries of the Fertile Crescent, several hundred kilometers away. This meant something profound. The cat did not arrive on Cyprus by its own means. It had to be brought, across water, in boats, likely in woven baskets or cages, or perhaps even held under the cloak of someone who had come to stay. People had carried seeds and animals before sheep, goats, wheat. But this was different. Unlike livestock, cats offered no meat, no milk, no fur. They could not be herded. They could not be yoked. So why bring one? Why bring several, as evidence now suggests? The answer may live in this grave. Not in the bones themselves, but in the space between them. The quiet respect of placement, the absence of violence, the symmetry of the resting forms. It is tempting to call this love. To imagine the person and the cat as companions, a shared life, a shared death. But love is not fossilized. It leaves no direct trace. All we have are echoes. Still, the echoes speak. The cat was buried, with its body intact, curled near the human side. It was not butchered. It bore no signs of sacrifice. Its position was not beneath or apart, but beside, equal in rest. That gesture alone suggests significance. There are cultures in which animals are buried for ritual, symbolic, or spiritual reasons. But at this time, on this island, the burial stands alone. There is no wider context, no established custom. It was an early act, maybe the first of its kind. And in that first, we glimpse something immense, a person, preparing to leave the world, and taking a cat with them. Or perhaps the cat followed, as it always had, quiet, watching, ready to stay, even beyond the firelight. To carry a cat across the sea is no small thing. It means planning. It means intention. The wildcat was not a creature easily confined. It did not submit. it did not follow. And yet, by 9,500 years ago, it had arrived on Cyprus. Not by its own will, but with people who thought it was worth bringing. That alone speaks volumes. Crossing the Mediterranean required boats large enough to hold tools, seeds, animals, and families. The journey was neither short nor smooth. It was risky. Every item on board mattered. Every breath of cargo had to earn its space. So why, in that delicate balance, make room for a predator that refused to be tamed? The answer may lie in the changing world these people carried with them. The first settlers of Cyprus came not as wanderers, but as planters. They brought with them agriculture, stored grain, the architecture of permanence. And with grain came rodents. The island, until then untouched by agriculture, quickly shifted. Rats and mice, following human stores, spread rapidly. Their nests bloomed in granaries, under walls, and beneath the boards of houses. The people noticed. They saw what the rodents did. They watched as their precious seed stores dwindled, as bags gnawed open and harvests spoiled in silence. But perhaps they also remembered something else. Back in the Levant, in villages like Jericho and Ain Malaha, there had been watchers in the dusk, slitted eyes catching movement, silent hunters leaving no tracks. The wildcats had not needed permission to hunt. They simply did what they had always done. And in doing so, they had helped. Maybe someone remembered that. Maybe someone caught a wildcat kitten, or several, raised near the granaries, kept close to home, not as pets, not yet, but as cohabitants, as guardians of food and space. That memory, once formed, would have power. It would have spread. And when people gathered to cross the sea, it may have seemed obvious. Bring the goats, bring the wheat, bring the cats. Not many would have made the journey, but even a few, nestled into creaking boats, would be enough to start again, enough to let the new settlements echo the old ones, in rhythm and presence. And at Shillourokambos, that presence found permanence. A grave carved into time, one human, one cat, resting side by side. We do not know the circumstances of their deaths, whether they passed together or separately, whether the cat was buried with the human as an act of grief or reverence or something else. But we know they were placed. We know the cat was not discarded. And that knowledge matters, because in a world ruled by necessity, there was no room for waste. Burial was not granted lightly. To be placed in the ground with care was a decision, a statement, even if it spoke without words. And what it said was simple. This one mattered. Archaeology rarely gives us feelings. It gives us layers, soil colours, bone maps, radiocarbon dates, and wear patterns. From these, we build stories, carefully, humbly, always aware that the people who lived them left no explanations, only traces. But sometimes those traces carry weight. At Shillourokambos, the soil held a shape, not just of bone, but of choice. The choice to place a cat beside a human, the choice to let that pairing endure, to preserve it beneath the ground as though it meant something more than chance. There was no altar, no painted mask, no engraved plaque to tell us why. But the silence speaks, the absence of harm, the symmetry of the burial, the proximity. They suggest that this was not a creature feared, not a nuisance, not a tool discarded with other waste. It had been close enough, long enough, to be included in death. That inclusion changes everything. It hints at something deeper than utility. Not domestication in the modern sense, but something approaching affection, or at least acknowledgement. A bond that was not based on command or control. A bond based on presence, on time spent together, on shared space, perhaps shared habits, shared rhythms of living, and perhaps that is the quiet secret of the cat. Unlike animals shaped for labour or food, cats gave nothing visible. They did not plough, they did not produce. They brought no wool, no eggs, no hauls of meat, but they offered something else. They offered a kind of companionship that asked for nothing, that hovered at the edge. that watched, waited, and returned. That kind of presence, once felt, is hard to ignore. The grave at Shillourokambos may have marked the end of 2 lives, but it also marked the beginning of something else. A shift, a recognition, a willingness to see the cat, not just as a hunter, but as a companion, not bound, not broken, but present. That shift would ripple outward. More cats would be brought to islands and settlements. More would stay near homes. Some would be buried. Others would be carved into stone or moulded in clay. Some would be held, maybe briefly. Others would be remembered. And slowly, over centuries, the idea of the cat would take root in the human mind, not just as a presence, but as a figure, a symbol, a creature with meaning. But it began here, on an island in the eastern Mediterranean, in a shallow grave, with no words, no script, just 2 bodies laid in the earth, side by side. And so, the cat passed from watcher to companion, still silent, still sharp, but now folded into the human world, not captured, not changed, simply allowed to remain. Even today, when we feel the flicker of a cat's gaze from the corner of a room, when we sense its quiet following, its soft judgment, its brief and distant trust, we are touching something very old. We are touching the long echo of that first burial, and the unspoken promise that came with it, to stay near, to not belong, but to be seen and remembered. They stayed near. They did not ask to be held, but they were remembered, and that is where the myth begins. How do we define domestication when the subject refuses to obey? For most animals living alongside humans, the story of domestication is fairly clear. There is selection, there is submission, a genetic shift over generations that reflects human control over breeding, over behavior, over reproduction itself. Dogs grow smaller jaws and floppy ears. Cattle become more docile. Wheat sheds its brittle husk. The organism bends to the will of its cultivator. Humans decide what survives and what is useful. And over time, the living thing becomes a tool, a product, a partner shaped by pressure. But when we try to apply that same model to cats, the framework begins to crack. Even today, domestic cats differ only slightly from their wild relatives. Genetically, the divergence is shallow. Many so-called domestic cats still interbreed freely with wild populations. The behaviors that define them, aloofness, independence, solitary hunting, have not been tamed out. They have been carried forward, intact, and largely untouched. So the question must be asked, did we domesticate cats, or did cats domesticate themselves? The earliest clues lie not in cages or collars, but in behavior, in ecology, in what scientists call self-domestication. This concept refers to species that adapt to human environments without being forcibly bred. They evolve not through captivity, but through proximity. The tamest individuals thrive, the most tolerant ones linger. Over time, selection favors calmness, low aggression, and comfort near humans not because we demand it, but because the environment rewards it. In this way, the cat may have sculpted its own path. Imagine a litter of wildcat kittens near a Natufian settlement. Some hiss and flee when they see a person, others freeze. A few, bolder or calmer by nature, remain. Those few find more food. They survive longer. They raise more young, and those young inherit that wary calm. Generation after generation, this cycle continues. No one ties them up. No one feeds them by hand. And yet slowly, they change. This is not the domestication of a sheep or a goat. This is evolution by shadows. Felis libica did not become a lap pet overnight. It drifted toward humanity through hundreds of soft, invisible steps. Each cat that stayed near campfires or storage pits carried within it a slight edge, a genetic tweak that made it less fearful, less aggressive, more attuned to human rhythms. These tiny changes accumulated, but they never erased the core of the cat's nature. The result is a paradox. A domestic species that is not quite tame, a companion that resists control, a presence that lives beside us, but not beneath us. Cats never performed for us. They never carried our loads. They were never yoked, or shorn. They never asked to be shaped, yet they stayed. And by staying, they became something new. What other species chose our world on its own terms? And what does that say about the nature of our bond? That bond was not forged by force. It was negotiated by presence. And presence, in the case of cats, is never accidental. It is selective, earned. What makes cats so unusual in the prehistoric world is not just that they lived near us, but that they remained mostly unchanged. The modern house cat is not a broken version of its wild ancestor. It is not reduced, simplified, or redesigned by human will. It is, for the most part, still a wild cat, one that simply learned to tolerate our noise, our warmth, our mess. This is perhaps the most profound rejection of the domestication model. Because while we tamed horses to ride, cattle to plough, and sheep to clothe us, the cat never gave in. It never learned tricks. It never accepted harness or halter. It never carried our burdens. It simply chose to stay close. And humans, in return, allowed it to remain. The archaeological record confirms this uneasy closeness. In early settlements, cat bones appear not in garbage heaps or kill sites, but near storerooms, near grain pits, near thresholds. They are rarely marked by butchery. They are not charred or splintered. They are whole. Their teeth show patterns of wear that suggest a varied diet. Rodents, yes, but also food scraps, fish bones, leftovers. It seems some were fed, or at least permitted to eat. And yet, even then, they did not enter the center of the human world. Not like dogs, who slept in camps and guarded homes. Cats lingered on the edge, at the doorway, on the wall, near, but not within. That edge space is where cats thrive. They are creatures of boundaries, of margins. In the wild, they patrol the line between field and forest. In villages, they walk rooftops and shadows. They slip between zones, never too far into the chaos, never too far from escape. That positioning, both physical and symbolic, may explain why humans never truly tried to control them. We sensed, perhaps, that control was not the point. Cats offered something else. Not service, not power, but stillness. In a world of smoke and shouting, where early humans tamed fire and fought over land, cats remained quiet. They moved with precision. They stalked pests without command. They kept to themselves. In doing so, they modeled a form of survival that required no herds, no tools, just attention. That independence was alien and perhaps even admirable. We often imagine ancient people as pragmatic, driven only by need. But human minds have always made space for mystery. And in the sleek, silent form of the cat, there was much to wonder at. Its glowing eyes, its night vision, its way of appearing without sound, and vanishing just as easily. It was hunter and ghost, predator and ornament, something that lived by its own rules, and yet it lived with us. So perhaps domestication is the wrong word entirely. Perhaps what happened between humans and cats was something rarer, a mutual tolerance, a fragile trust, a shared environment where neither species tried to dominate the other, a pact written not in obedience but in coexistence. That perhaps is the true heart of the feline myth. Not that we tamed cats, but that we lived beside something untamable, and still do. In the ruins of early villages, the outlines of this relationship linger. There are no cat harnesses buried in the earth, no feeding troughs, no leashes or tools of control. There are no murals of men herding cats, no glyphs of cats pulling carts or dragging sledges. What survives instead are traces. A jawbone with healed injuries, suggesting someone helped it survive. A paw print fossilized in clay, faint scratches on the doorframes of ancient granaries. All of it small, all of it subtle, and all of it pointing to a creature that lived with us, not under us. That distinction matters, because in nearly every other human-animal story, the arc bends toward control. We harness the wild, we redirect it, we assign it a place. But cats denied placement. They carved out their own, and we allowed it. In doing so, we entered into a different kind of contract. A quiet cat in a corner kept grains safe from mice. It asked nothing. It took no orders. It simply did what it had always done, and in return, it was left alone. Maybe even welcomed, maybe even watched with admiration. This contract had no name, no ceremony, no mark in clay tablets. Yet it endured, across centuries and civilizations. It passed from the Natufians to the early peoples of Cyprus, from there into Mesopotamia, then Egypt, then the empires that followed. Cats, always there, not as livestock, not as labor, but as something stranger, something more liminal, and that may be the source of their enduring power. They are not pets in the traditional sense, not tools, not trophies. They are guests. They are ghosts. They are the old presence in the corner of the room. And deep in the human psyche, that presence left a mark. Over time, myths grew around them. In some places, they were sacred. In others, feared. Witches familiars, keepers of the underworld, protectors of souls. Their silence made them a canvas for belief. Their solitude became a mirror. People saw in cats what they needed to see: grace, patience, mystery, menace. But underneath all that myth-making remained the simple truth. Cats stayed near because they wanted to, and humans let them stay because it worked. Domestication usually ends in dominance. But this story ends differently, with compromise, with mutual advantage, with two species learning how to live near one another without war, without rule. And that is a kind of success more subtle than conquest. The cat's journey into human life was not marked by surrender. It was marked by permission. Not once, but thousands of times. One household at a time. One sleeping mat. One storeroom. One flicker of firelight catching the reflection of eyes in the dark. They came close. Close enough to touch, but never close enough to hold. And maybe that was the point. Even so, time did its quiet work. In the oldest human settlements, where grain was stored in clay bins and food waste piled up behind stone walls, cats lingered. They stayed, not because they were owned, but because the ecosystem had changed. The rodent population had exploded. Mice and rats found homes in our storerooms, tunnels in our walls. And the cats, who had once been silent watchers of desert brush and thorny scrub, began to adjust. What signs can we trace of this subtle shift? How does a creature begin to change not through force or captivity, but by proximity? That is the quiet but persistent question behind this chapter. In modern biology, domestication is usually marked by clear signs: floppy ears, curled tails, changed temperaments. Yet with cats, the line is blurred. The earliest signs of change appear almost imperceptibly in the fossil record. Skulls with slightly shortened snouts, jawbones more gracile, a few with teeth worn differently than their wild cousins. These changes did not happen all at once. They arrived slowly, scattered across time like a trail of shallow footprints in soft earth. One of the earliest and clearest traces comes from the Neolithic layers of sites like Çatalhöyük and Shillourokambos. Here, archaeologists have unearthed feline remains with cranial shapes that differ slightly from Felis libica, the African wildcat. The changes are small but consistent: wider foreheads, less pronounced brow ridges, subtly shortened muzzles. Scientists believe these may represent early evolutionary divergence, not full domestication, but a step on that long and winding path. It is in the coat patterns, too, that the story begins to change. The wildcat is typically a dusty, striped animal, camouflage suited to arid grasslands. But by the Bronze Age, some cats began to show blotched or spotted patterns. Genetic analysis suggests that this mutation, responsible for the tabby coat, did not exist in wild cat populations. It appeared, instead, in populations near human settlements. It is possible that people found these coats aesthetically pleasing, or easier to distinguish from wild types. But whether or not it was intentional selection, the frequency of these genes increased over time. Behavior changed too, though this leaves less trace. Modern ethologists have noted that feral domestic cats differ from wild cats in social behavior. Wild cats are generally solitary. But cats living near humans display tolerance. They may form loose colonies, especially where food is abundant. This tolerance likely evolved in response to a new environment, where multiple cats shared a resource-rich niche, garbage piles, grain stores they needed to avoid constant conflict. So, over generations, the more tolerant individuals may have fared better, lived longer, passed on their genes. None of this suggests that early people were breeding cats. There is no evidence of enclosures, no kitten nurseries, or deliberate pairings. But behavior has a way of shaping evolution all the same, and so, change began to unfold, silently, gradually, not through command, but through adaptation. And it was the village that became the crucible. For cats, human settlements were not just places of food, they were landscapes of selection. The smell of dried grain, the rustle of vermin in the walls, the rhythmic noise of daily life, all of these shaped the feline world. And the cats that remained, that thrived in that space, were the ones best suited to it. Not just physically, psychologically. Skittish wildcats, those easily spooked by sound or human movement, would flee. They would retreat into the wild. But those born with even a slight disposition toward boldness, toward calmness near humans, found food, found safety, found, eventually, acceptance. Over time, these subtle behavioral advantages became biological ones. This process, known as behavioral domestication, did not rely on intention, it was evolution through social filtering. The cat that did not panic at the clang of a pot or the sudden burst of firelight near the hearth had more opportunities. It learned to move through the camp rather than around it. At first, this change may have looked like nothing, just a single bold cat, staying close. Then a few. Then an entire line. And as these bold cats spread, they brought with them changes in appearance too. Traits linked to tameness often carry physical markers. In other domesticated species, these can include reduced adrenal responses, altered ear shapes, changes in tail carriage, and pigmentation shifts. With cats, the most visible was the coat. Spots and blotches rather than stripes. Lighter bellies, patches of white. These were not just cosmetic. They signaled a shift in the animal's baseline biology. Still, this evolutionary current moved slowly. It unfolded over millennia. And at every stage, cats remained semi-independent. They were never corralled, never tied. Their relationship with humans was permissive, not possessive. And perhaps this very freedom allowed their evolution to continue, undisturbed by the narrowing pressures of full domestication. Evidence of this ongoing shift appears again and again in the archaeological record. At the ancient port of Berenike, on the Red Sea coast of Egypt, bones of cats dating to the early Roman period reveal a mix of traits. Some resemble wild cats. Others show shorter skulls, broader nasal passages, and changed dentition. It's as if two versions of the species existed in tandem, the ancestral type and the adapted form, living side by side. And even more tellingly, these cat remains are often found in places of human importance. Storerooms, shrines, burials. They were not pests, nor were they food. They were part of the structure of human life, increasingly integrated into its rhythms. By this stage, the cat was no longer just a wanderer. It had become a resident, a presence embedded in the daily pattern of human survival, not by leash or fence, but by choice. And evolution, slow though it is, had begun to draw its line. What began as a trickle had become a quiet current, flowing through the DNA of village cats. Even if no one noticed, even if no one meant for it to happen. Still, generation after generation, something shifted beneath the fur and bone. The cat that curled beneath a storage bench in an Anatolian home, the one that stalked rats in the granaries of Jericho, the litter of kittens born behind a clay oven in the Levant. Each one carried the echo of a choice made long ago. The decision to stay close, to remain near the warmth of the fire, to sleep lightly, but not too far from human voices. And that nearness, practiced over centuries, began to alter the species. Modern genetic studies confirm this invisible history. When scientists sequenced ancient feline DNA from burial sites and settlements across the Near East, they found something astonishing: a pattern of continuity. The same mitochondrial haplogroup, known as IVA, kept appearing. From early Neolithic towns to Iron Age trade routes, the same genetic signature persisted. It suggests that the lineage of cats who lived near humans spread outward, following the sprawl of civilization. But genetics tells only part of the story. The other part lies in behavior, in subtle shifts passed not by blood, but by imitation. A kitten raised near people learns not just how to hunt mice, but how to move through a human space. It learns the rhythms of our world, the scraping of a bowl, the meaning of footsteps, the places where warmth gathers and food appears. These are not genetic traits, but they shape a cat's survival just the same. And the more cats learned to navigate this shared world, the more indispensable they became. They kept rodents out of food stores, they deterred snakes, they marked their territory, and, in doing so, helped keep pests at bay. Their usefulness was not flashy, not dramatic. It was quiet, constant, and over time, it likely made them welcome in places where few other predators were allowed to stay. Still, even as their bones changed shape and their coats grew more varied, cats never crossed fully into domesticity. Not in the way dogs or livestock did. There was no single moment of taming, no universal threshold. Instead, there was a long and fluid middle ground, a space between wild and tame, between guest and inhabitant. That is where the cat has always lived. In the liminal space, evolution, in this case, did not erase the wild. It simply softened it. The claws remained sharp, the instincts intact, but the eyes lingered longer on human faces. The body stayed curled a little closer to the hearth, and the ears twitched not just for prey, but for voices. By the end of this slow transformation, the wildcat had become something else. Still itself, but altered, not domesticated in the usual sense, but adapted, changed by its nearness to us, not conquered, but changed, and that change would carry them far. The fact that cats were changed, but not broken, is perhaps the most telling clue of all. Why did their path diverge so profoundly from that of dogs? This is not just a curiosity. It is a mirror held up to the ways in which humans interact with the world. Because somewhere in the long prehistoric arc, two animals made the same choice. They stepped closer to us. And yet only one became obedient, eager, dependent. The other stayed silent, aloof, changed, yes, but never fully ours. To understand that difference, we must return to the very roots of domestication. The story of the dog is older, perhaps as much as 15,000 years older, depending on which archaeological site we trust most. And that story begins with the wolf. Fierce, pack-bound, cautious, but clever. In the frozen margins of the late Pleistocene, a few bold wolves lingered near human camps, drawn not just by the smell of food, but by something deeper, an opportunity. These early wolves were likely smaller, less aggressive, more curious than their kin, traits that would, over generations, be amplified by proximity. And here is the key difference. With dogs, humans interfered. Once that relationship was established, it became a project. Selective breeding altered not only behavior, but bodies. Skull shape, ear posture, limb proportions, even the structure of the digestive tract. Within a few millennia, wolves were transformed into a mosaic of new forms: hunters, herders, guardians, companions. Each designed, however unconsciously at first, to suit a human role. Dogs were sculpted, but cats were not. In all the ancient sites where feline remains have been found, from Neolithic Cyprus to Roman-era Egypt, there is no evidence of mass breeding. No kennels, no fenced enclosures, no litters born under controlled hands. The fossil record does not show rapid morphological change. What it shows instead is gradual drift, subtle distinctions, Slight changes in size, coat variation, and behavior. It is not the architecture of engineering, it is the erosion of a riverbank. Slow, relentless, guided more by environment than by hand. This is why scientists call the cat a commensal domesticate. It lived alongside us. It benefited from the world we created, but it was not created by us. And that distinction opens a deeper question, one that presses beyond biology and into culture. What does it mean that one species became our tool while the other remained an observer? Some anthropologists argue that cats domesticated themselves, that this is not a tale of control, but of coexistence. Others suggest that humans were simply less motivated to shape cats, that their utility was passive, their cooperation unnecessary. And so, the changes that did occur were tolerated rather than pursued. A kind of mutual indifference, tempered only by need. Whichever theory holds more truth, the outcome is clear. One animal became a partner, the other became a presence, and between them a quiet contrast unfolds. That quiet contrast is more than biological. It is also emotional. When humans shaped dogs, they did not only mold flesh, they reshaped instinct. The pack bond of the wolf was redirected toward people. Dogs began to read our faces. They responded to our voices. Oxytocin levels, the same hormone involved in parent-child bonding, rise in both humans and dogs during moments of affectionate contact. Something extraordinary happened. Wolves who once stalked from the tree line had, in time, curled into the corners of our homes and our hearts. With cats, the transformation was far more muted. They never chased approval. They didn't wait for cues. They tolerated affection, sometimes even sought it, but not as a rule. Their emotional language remained mostly unchanged. Tail flicks, eye blinks, the low hum of a purr. These were not engineered responses. They were ancestral ones. Adapted, slightly softened, but never overwritten. This is not to say the relationship was cold. It was simply different. A cat could sit beside you and never ask to be seen. It could spend years in your life, yet never lose the thread of solitude that defined it. For some early humans, that may have been appealing. Cats required little training, little maintenance. They were not tools, not livestock. They were presents with teeth. Still half wild, still half gone, still glancing toward the tall grass even while resting on a human stone threshold. And yet, they stayed. What does that say about us? Perhaps something simple, that not all relationships are based on dominance or utility. Some are based on parallel benefit, on toleration, even on the strange comfort of proximity, just close enough to see, but never to hold. In that quiet space between, something ancient and wordless passed back and forth. Not ownership, not control, just the soft rhythm of shared time. Archaeological finds support this parallelism. In early agricultural settlements, where dog skeletons show clear signs of breeding and specialization, cats appear far more uniformly. Their bones are scattered, not centralized. Their remains show fewer injuries from confinement or human handling. In fact, in many sites, cats appear more like neighbors than pets. Their bodies left behind in middens, their paw prints found, pressed into clay tiles or storage jars. Glimpses, traces, ghosts in the corners of the human world. And yet the survival of those traces suggests a remarkable stability. Cats had found a place, not as captives, but as cohabitants. They fit into the rhythm of early settled life, like punctuation fits into a sentence. Unnecessary in a grammatical sense, but deeply felt when missing. Without cats, something in the ecological balance faltered. Rodents increased. Food stores diminished. The system stuttered. Grain was lost. Disease found new vectors. The quiet predator's absence was felt not in cries but in consequence. So they stayed, and their staying reshaped them. Over time, some coat patterns became more common. The blotched tabby, the spotted rosette. Skull shapes rounded slightly. Ears grew more varied. Meows became more frequent. a possible adaptation to human environments where vocal communication mattered. These were not traits selected for by breeders. They were the results of survival in a human-dominated landscape. They were small edits written by the environment, silent, invisible, but irreversible. Yet, even as these small changes accumulated, there remained something unclaimed in the cat, something untouched by domestication's typical grip. Dogs became extensions of us. Their loyalty was not just emotional, it was functional. They guarded our homes, pulled our sleds, chased our prey, and watched our flocks. Their usefulness justified their transformation. They were, in a very real sense, shaped into tools with hearts. Cats never crossed that threshold. There were no herding cats, no hunting cats trained to retrieve, no packs of cats hauling sleds across frozen steppes. Instead, they served in silence. They kept the granaries clean. They thinned the mice in homes and storage pits. Their reward was not praise, it was survival. Shelter, a full belly, the occasional fire-warmed stone to curl upon. Their value was measured not by what they did, but by what they prevented. Perhaps that is why the human-cat bond has always felt mysterious. It was not built on command and compliance, it was built on coexistence. A meeting of two species who preferred to move quietly, who shared a taste for solitude, who understood, without explanation, the art of watching. In this way, cats became a mirror of our changing selves. As humans shifted from wandering hunters to settled agriculturalists, we too changed. Our needs, our rhythms, our very landscapes. We no longer chased game across windswept plains. We stayed in one place. We built walls. We kept food in storage, not in our bellies. And with that storage came pests. With pests came a problem. And with that problem, a solution arrived. Not in the form of a roaring beast, but a quiet shadow at the edge of the light. The African wildcat was not tamed in the traditional sense. It simply adapted. Gradually, elegantly. It changed enough to remain close, but not so much that it lost its essence. And humans, perhaps to their credit, did not force it further. This relationship, delicate and unspoken, endured. Over time, it began to etch itself into the margins of culture, into myth, into ritual. In some early settlements, bones of cats are found buried with care. In others, paw prints appear beside human tools, not often, never centrally, but persistently, like a background rhythm. Faint, but always there. By the time written history began, the cat was already in the room, and it had not been summoned. It had simply arrived and stayed. This is what makes the story of feline domestication unique. Not its speed or its scope, but its restraint. It is a tale of evolution without force, of alliance without surrender, of closeness that never became dependency. The dog was remade by human hands. The cat, in contrast, remained mostly as it was. And yet, it changed. Slowly, quietly. Not because it was compelled to, but because the world around it shifted. And it chose, generation by generation, to stay close enough to survive. Not leashed, not bred, just there. And that was enough. But shadows don't stay still forever. They move with the firelight. They drift with the winds. And sometimes they cross the sea. The question that rises quietly, like the tide against an unfamiliar shore, is this. How did cats, solitary creatures of dry land, find themselves on islands, in harbours, and aboard the vessels of ancient seafarers? There is no wild population of Felis libica native to Cyprus, and yet a cat was buried there more than 9,000 years ago. The implication is subtle, but extraordinary. Someone had to bring it, perhaps not in a cage, perhaps not as a cherished companion, but surely not by accident. No wildcat would choose to leap aboard a swaying boat with no promise of escape. The conclusion that many archaeologists have drawn is cautious, but firm. Early humans brought cats to islands intentionally. To understand this, we must look at the nature of the earliest sea crossings in the eastern Mediterranean. By the time of the pre-pottery Neolithic B period, humans were already navigating between mainland Levantine settlements and islands like Cyprus. These were not mythic Odyssean voyages. They were real, pragmatic undertakings. Journeys made to move livestock, grain, tools, obsidian, goats, and even dogs. And evidently, something else with fur and claws. Something quiet, but watchful. Something wild, but not unwelcome. In these early boats, woven of reed or hollowed from massive tree trunks, cargo space was precious. Nothing extraneous was taken. So if cats were included, they must have served a purpose. Grain, as always, may have been the quiet culprit. Just as rodents followed human surplus into the villages of the Fertile Crescent, they likely found their way into sacks and baskets aboard ships, stowaways with twitching noses and gnawing teeth. And in response, another passenger, the cat. It's difficult to reconstruct the exact nature of those early voyages. No painted fresco shows a kitten on a sailor's lap. No clay tablet records the moment a wildcat was coaxed onto a boat, but the archaeological trail whispers hints. Cat bones found near ancient port sites, shifts in feline genetic markers that suggest population bottlenecks consistent with maritime dispersal, patterns of coat colour mutation that spread westward from the Levant in a manner eerily consistent with human trade routes. Cyprus was only the beginning. From there, the pattern repeated, to Crete, to the Cyclades, to the coast of Anatolia, to the Nile Delta. The cat was no longer a strictly local creature. It had taken its first step, sometimes literally, into global movement. It now existed in the same breath as obsidian and oil, woven mats and millet. It belonged to the human world, and yet remained just outside its centre. And still, the question lingers, like the scent of salt in wood. Did they sit quietly in the prow, eyes wide in the wind? Did they pace the edges, ears flattened, scenting the strange sea air? Or were they hidden, half feral, clinging to baskets of millet and barley in the belly of the boat? Whatever the answer, something changed when the cat crossed the water. It ceased to be merely a village creature. It became something more. A traveller, an emigrant, a participant in one of humanity's most ambitious experiments, the crossing of worlds. New shores brought new challenges. For the humans who made the crossing, island life demanded adaptation. They had to rebuild homes from unfamiliar wood, plant grain in thinner soil, and find new rhythms beneath a changed sky. But what of the cats? Their role was less visible, yet equally transformative. On Cyprus, as in other islands, settlements grew in concentric layers around stored grain. The same problem that plagued mainland villages arrived with them. Mice and rats flourished in these new havens of human abundance. The rodents were quick to burrow beneath woven baskets, to chew through sacks, to build nests in the warmth of thatched roofs. They were as adaptable as the people themselves, and behind them, perhaps hidden at first, came their shadow, the cat. These early cats, descendants of Felis libica, did not need to be led by the hand. They needed only the scent of prey and the occasional tolerance of humans. There is no reason to think they were welcomed with open arms. But neither were they driven out. At some point, an unspoken truce must have formed. If you keep the grain safe, you may sleep by the hearth. If you kill the vermin, we will not chase you with stones. It is likely this relationship was renewed at every port. Each island settlement built new granaries. Each granary attracted mice. And each ship that docked brought its own whispering feline passenger, ready to begin the dance once more. The humans may not have thought of them as pets. They may not have given them names or woven them into family stories, but they brought them nonetheless, perhaps reluctantly, perhaps as a necessary evil, or perhaps with quiet gratitude. Archaeological layers in places like Kyrikisia and Kalivassos show more than just broken tools and bone fragments. They reveal the steady presence of cats among the refuse, cats that no longer matched the measurements of their wild ancestors exactly. Slightly shorter faces, slightly smaller teeth, a gentler curvature of the spine. Evolution was not frozen by the sea. It was reshaped by proximity. And the more the cats lived beside humans, the more their behavior shifted. Not all became friendly. Many surely remained elusive, seen only by moonlight as they hunted the perimeters. But others drew closer. They learned the schedules of cooking fires, the rhythm of doors opening, the timing of sleep and waking. Some might have waited patiently near refuse piles. Others may have climbed roofs, watching the world with luminous patience. By the late Neolithic, this pattern had become a slow tide of feline expansion. One that moved not with conquest, but with crumbs and chaos. One that left no ruins, but changed the world grain by grain, claw by claw. And as sails grew larger and hulls more stable, the journey of the cat had only just begun. The wind did not care for the quiet passengers below deck. It filled the sails and drove the boats forward, across the turquoise shimmer of the Mediterranean. But as humans ventured further, so too did their shadows. Not just in stories and tools, but in the eyes that blinked from baskets, in the soft pads that landed without sound on new stone. Cats moved without fanfare. They did not require permission. They slipped through the gaps of history, trailing behind sailors and farmers as invisibly as smoke. Yet their trail is real. In the bones buried beneath ancient harbours, in the genetic signatures carried from Levantine plains to Cretan hillsides, in the faint echo of paw prints across 1,000 forgotten shores. By the time humans settled in places like Ugarit, Byblos, and the Nile Delta, cats had already earned their place. They no longer needed to be tolerated. In some places, they began to be welcomed, slowly, quietly, with offerings of food or scraps, with a space near the fire, with a gentle hand that no longer flinched from claws. Trade accelerated their spread. With grain came rats. With rats came cats. Markets did not only trade ceramics and copper, they exchanged pests and predators. When a trader returned from the Aegean or coasted down to North Africa, there might have been a slender cat curled among the baskets, tail flicking. It was no longer a creature of the wild margins. It had become a passenger, a tool, a talisman, and sometimes more than that. In some port towns, cats may have begun to take on symbolic value, not yet sacred in the way they would become in Egypt, but noticed, watched, admired for their strange poise and silence. Perhaps a fisherman, after a good haul, left a fish near the cat that waited on the dock. Perhaps a child gave a name to one that lingered in the shadow of her family's home. Perhaps someone drew its form on a broken potsherd, a curve, a tail, a memory. The transformation was underway, not by leash or law, but by repetition, by 1,000 small moments that stitched the animal into human life. And the cats, for their part, adapted, not in their bones just yet, but in their behavior, in their boldness, in the way they lingered longer near the door, returned more quickly to the hearth. It is easy to think of domestication as a single moment, a contract signed in metaphor. But the spread of cats by boat tells a different story. This was not the work of breeders. This was not a project carved in stone. It was a drift, a slow weaving of lives. The humans carried the cats across water, but the cats made themselves at home. So, when we picture that small burial in Cyprus, we should not see it as an isolated kindness. We should see it as the flowering of something older, the fruit of a journey that began before sails and cargo, before names and graves. The cat had stepped aboard. It had crossed the sea, and by doing so, it had crossed into our story, for good. But the voyage of the cat did not stop at the shore. It found new meaning in the mud-brick temples and palm-shaded courtyards of the Nile Valley. What strange forces transformed this quiet predator into a sacred icon of an entire civilization? The Nile was not just a river, it was a spine of life, threading together hundreds of communities that stretched from the delta in the north to the cataracts far south. On its banks, the earliest pharaohs raised their monuments, charted the stars, and managed the flood. And within this living system, cats carved out a space that was both practical and symbolic. Their initial role was likely the same as it had always been. They hunted rodents and snakes. They slipped through the granaries of places like Hierakonpolis and Buto, their presence tolerated, even welcomed. This had happened before, in other cultures. But something in Egypt was different. There was a turning point, one that is difficult to date precisely, but which seems to emerge slowly between the predynastic and early dynastic periods, perhaps around 3000 BCE. Archaeologists have uncovered painted fragments that show lithe, spotted cats in poses of repose or aggression. These were not accidental doodles. They were deliberate depictions, stylized and set within ritual contexts, as if the cat was not merely being recorded, it was being honored. What made the Egyptians begin to see the cat as divine? The answer may lie, in part, in the cat's character. Unlike dogs, which bark and obey, the cat remains enigmatic. It chooses its own time. It watches without judgment. And it kills with elegance. In a culture where balance and cosmic order art were central concepts, perhaps the cat embodied a kind of perfect harmony. A predator that never disrupted. A being that moved between home and wilderness, death and life, without needing to explain itself. One of the earliest deities associated with cats was Mafdet. She was not gentle. She was a slayer of serpents, a protector against chaos. Often depicted with a feline head or body, Mafdet's power was legal and spiritual. Her presence appears in tombs from the First Dynasty. Later, she was overshadowed by another feline goddess, Bastet. Bastet is one of the most enduring symbols of ancient Egypt. Initially a lioness deity of war, she evolved into a gentler protector, often shown with the face of a domestic cat. She was a goddess of fertility, music, and motherhood, yet she retained claws beneath the surface. Her temples drew pilgrims, her statues were placed in homes, and her sacred animals, living cats, were bred and raised in temple precincts. But it was not only religion that elevated the cat. Something deeper was at work. A cultural affection, perhaps even reverence, had taken root. The Egyptian worldview saw no clear line between sacred and mundane. A cat in the home could be a companion, a guardian spirit, and a divine symbol all at once. Cats did not simply occupy a place in Egyptian belief. They were given physical space in the very architecture of worship. In the city of Bubastis, along the eastern edge of the Nile Delta, rose one of the grandest sanctuaries dedicated to Bastet. Pilgrims came bearing offerings, not just to the goddess, but to her living representatives, scores of temple cats that roamed the courtyards, groomed in the shade of sycamore trees, and stared down supplicants with unblinking calm. Inside the temple precincts, cats were pampered. They were fed well, protected, and in some cases adorned with amulets or decorative collars. Some even had their own handlers, priests who cared for them not only as animals, but as sacred beings, intermediaries between mortal and divine. When one of these cats died, it was not left to the elements. It was embalmed, carefully, lovingly. Mummified cats became votive offerings, expressions of devotion purchased by worshippers and left at shrines. Some were family pets, others were bred within the temple economy for this very purpose. The scale of cat mummification was immense. Excavations in Bubastis and Saqqara have unearthed chambers filled with tightly packed bundles, thousands upon thousands of feline remains wrapped in linen. These were not hasty jobs. Skilled embalmers took time with the process. In well-preserved examples, the wrappings were precise, geometric, symmetrical. In some, the features of the cat can still be seen beneath the cloth, ears tucked, eyes closed. A final gesture of peace. And it was not only bodies that were wrapped. Some cat mummies contain small tokens, bronze charms, tiny scarabs, amulets placed with care between the folds. X-rays have revealed that in rare cases, cats were buried with broken limbs or missing bones, perhaps the result of ritual sacrifice. Not all deaths were gentle, yet even these suggest a belief in the importance of ritual, of honouring what was given. Art reinforced this reverence. Tomb paintings from the New Kingdom show cats beneath chairs, beside their owners, curled near platters of food. They are not wild, they are present, purposeful. The tomb of Nebumun features one of the most famous feline depictions in ancient art. A cat leaping mid-air to seize a bird in flight, golden eyes blazing with intelligence. It is both hunter and housemate, a guardian of the threshold. Even language bore the mark of the cat's influence. The Egyptian word for cat, mew or mute, is likely onomatopoeic, a mimicry of the sound kittens make. To name something by its voice is to grant it identity. Cats were not livestock. They were known. They were heard. In Egyptian society, the cat was never just one thing. It was utility and mystery, predator and protector. Even its silence spoke volumes. It is no wonder that the boundaries between pet and god became so thin, sometimes vanishing entirely. The line between affection and worship had long since blurred. Not every cat in Egypt lived inside temple walls. Most still prowled the streets, storerooms and granaries. They were workers, not icons. Yet even those outside the sanctuaries were touched by the cultural elevation that had changed the species' role. In marketplaces, people left scraps for cats. Farmers allowed them to roam their fields. Sailors brought them aboard boats to guard cargo from rodents. Their utility was undeniable. But something more had taken root. Respect. The cat had become part of the Egyptian worldview. It was integrated into their concept of ma'at, the principle of order and balance that governed everything from law to cosmology. Cats hunted mice. They kept food stores intact. They maintained the household equilibrium. In this way, they were not simply tolerated. They were seen as agents of harmony. Their very presence signaled a world in alignment. This reverence reached far beyond life. Cats, like humans, were guided into the afterlife. In some households, when a pet cat died, the family entered mourning. There are records of people shaving their eyebrows as a sign of grief. They buried cats with care, placing them alongside small jars of milk or dried fish, offerings for the journey beyond. Sometimes, they even commissioned small statues or stelae engraved with the animal's likeness and name. One remarkable tomb inscription reads, "Beloved of Bastet, the one who guarded the doorway and slept in the linen basket." There is humour in this, tenderness too. It is the voice of someone who lived with a cat, watched its habits, and loved it for what it was. These moments remind us that domestication is not just a biological process. It is emotional, relational, full of nuance. But Egypt's love for cats was not permanent, nor immune to change. As foreign powers entered the Nile Valley first, the Assyrians, then Persians, Greeks, and finally Romans' belief systems shifted. Baste, once a lioness and later a domestic cat, began to lose her prominence. Temples fell into disrepair. Mummification practices continued for a time, but gradually declined, and with them, the idea of the sacred cat began to fade. Still, the legacy remained. Greek writers marveled at the way Egyptians treated cats. Roman tourists brought stories of cat temples home with them. Even when the empire changed, cats stayed. Their status had shifted, but they were never forgotten. They lingered on walls, in statues, in dusty burial vaults beneath temple floors, and of course, in the homes. The Egyptian phase of feline history tells a rare story, not just of practical benefit or ecological fit, but of cultural ascent. In no other ancient society did the cat rise so far, from mouse catcher to divine companion, from courtyard stalker to sacred symbol of grace and protection. In the long arc of domestication, Egypt stands alone in what it made of the cat, not just a partner, a deity, a mirror of elegance, patience, and quiet power. Even now, thousands of years later, when a cat stretches in the sun, glances your way with slow blinking eyes, something ancient stirs, a memory not entirely yours, a gesture left behind in stone and linen, waiting to be seen again. Grace and reverence, it seems, are never fixed in the human imagination. What once glimmered as sacred may, in time, dull beneath the weight of need. The same hands that offered milk in a bowl could also reach for the knife. Once a creature becomes useful, it becomes vulnerable. And the cat, for all its mystery, was no exception. In ancient Egypt, where cats had once roamed freely through temples and tombs, their image stamped into amulets and carved into stone, something changed. The lines between sacred and sacrificial began to blur. It started with the pilgrims. As Egyptian religion flourished and temples grew into powerful centers of wealth and influence, the act of devotion became transactional. Pilgrims arrived in the thousands to cities like Bubastis and Saqqara. They came bearing offerings, prayers, coins, and the hope of divine favor. And many of them, guided by priests, purchased one particular object of worship: a mummified cat. These feline remains, wrapped in linen and sealed in terracotta jars, became tokens of piety, a gesture offered to Bastet, the cat-headed goddess who watched over households, fertility, and protection. To offer a cat mummy was to gain her blessing. For the temple economy, it was a perfect system. Demand was endless. And so, supply had to grow. Archaeologists have uncovered vast necropolises of these mummified cats. At Bubastis alone, millions were buried. But closer examination reveals something unsettling. These were not honored pets. They were not aged companions buried after a life well lived. Most were juveniles. Some not yet weaned. Their bones tell a quiet and brutal story. Through CT scans and forensic study, researchers discovered that many of these cats suffered broken necks. The fractures are consistent, precise, and deliberate. They show no signs of long-term illness or injury. The deaths were not slow, they were efficient. These cats had been bred, raised, and sacrificed at scale. Temples had become breeding grounds. Litters of kittens were kept for short lives, cared for just enough to be viable. Once old enough, they were killed and wrapped, their small bodies sold to travelers seeking divine favor. The process persisted for generations. And while some might still argue this was reverence in its own form, the industrial scale of it suggests something colder. This was a spiritual economy, and in that economy, the cat had become a product. The reach of this trade did not end at the Nile. As Egyptian influence spread, so too did the symbolism of the cat. Across the Mediterranean, feline imagery found its way into art and custom, but with that expansion came new interpretations. In colder climates, where warmth meant survival, fur became a commodity. The sleek coat of a cat, soft and pliable, was repurposed. Though records are sparse and unspecific, hints remain in the ledgers of Roman merchants and early European traders. References to small skins and fine pelts leave gaps that only context can fill. Even the sacred can be hunted. Even a god can be skinned, yet cruelty alone never tells the whole story. Behind every act of violence was a logic, however cold, born of the needs of a growing world. As human societies expanded in complexity, so did their relationship with animals. The cat, once a solitary guardian of grain stores and spiritual protector of the hearth, had become enmeshed in a global web of utility, superstition, and commerce. The rise of long-distance trade across the Mediterranean and beyond carried not only goods, but creatures. Exotic animals were prized by elites. Monkeys, parrots, leopards, and yes, cats, travelled in the bellies of ships. In some cases they were gifted, in others they were bought, sold, or captured outright. And as cats moved across the known world, the value they held shifted depending on the eyes that beheld them. In parts of ancient Greece, cats remained a curiosity. They were admired for their poise, agility, and talent for keeping mice at bay. But unlike the Egyptians, the Greeks did not wrap their bodies in linen and bury them in sacred tombs. Instead, cats were often seen as novelties or practical pest control, no more divine than a well-balanced broom. By the time of the Roman Empire, the line between reverence and exploitation grew thinner still. Roman villas occasionally kept cats, especially in agricultural regions plagued by rodents. But more often, they favoured weasels or ferrets. These animals, easily trained and aggressively territorial, were better suited for hunting vermin. Cats, with their aloof temperaments and slow rate of reproduction, were considered less efficient. That is, until their fur became the object of interest. The coat of a wild cat, especially those from Africa or Anatolia, held a certain luxurious sheen. Its texture was finer than goat hair and more supple than the hide of sheep. Among certain markets, particularly in the cooler regions of the empire, fur from small animals was used to line cloaks, gloves, and bedding. While dogs and rabbits were most common, historical hints suggest cats were not exempt. In fragmented Roman texts and merchant inventories, scholars have noted repeated references to soft-bellied small beasts and striped house skinners. These cryptic terms, when paired with archaeological remains, imply that cats may have been among those harvested. While not hunted en masse like later in medieval fur trades, they were nonetheless vulnerable, and so, the hunter found itself hunted. This inversion was not uniform, nor was it always driven by cruelty. Some cats, in rural villages, remained beloved members of households. They curled beneath beds, waited patiently near fires, and purred in the laps of children. But others, especially strays and ferals, were caught in a shifting tide. Their population had spread. Their usefulness had splintered into many interpretations, and their position in human society was no longer secure. With abundance came disposability. When an animal becomes too common, its presence is no longer a marvel. It is a fact, a backdrop, a resource. The same species that once slept beside the dead in Cyprus, that watched from temple steps, was now found skinned and stretched on the racks of markets. Some called this practical, others necessary. But beneath those justifications was an uneasy truth. Once sacred, the cat had become silent prey. Yet even in the midst of exploitation, the cat retained something untouchable. Across vast stretches of territory from the Nile Delta to the mountain passes of Persia, from Roman markets to Celtic settlements, there lingered a quiet reluctance to fully categorize the feline. It was a paradox. At once a commodity and a mystery. At once a living tool and a living omen. In the shadowed corners of European forests, early folk traditions began to cast the cat in a darker light, no longer just useful or sacred, now also suspicious. Its eyes reflected firelight unnaturally. Its movements were too soundless, its presence too uncanny. This wasn't reverence, it was unease. In some pre-Christian rites, particularly among Germanic and Slavic tribes, cats were seen as creatures who travelled between worlds, not yet demons, not quite gods, but something that listened when no one else did. This perception would eventually feed into medieval superstitions, but its roots stretched deeper, growing from that long and contradictory bond humans had carried since the first wildcat stepped into the grain stores of Ain Malaha. Meanwhile, in the economic centres of the ancient world, a quieter industry formed around feline bodies. As cat populations grew in urban areas, especially where sanitation was poor and food was abundant, they became targets for control. Sometimes this meant simple removal. Other times, it meant killing. And with every death, new uses were found: fur, bone, even organs. In a world driven by scarcity and survival, few things were ever wasted. In Egypt, despite the religious reverence that had surrounded cats for centuries, a dark twist emerged. Mummified cats, once genuine expressions of devotion, became commercialized. As pilgrimages to temples increased, the demand for votive offerings outpaced natural feline death. And so, cats were bred in large numbers specifically to be sacrificed. They were raised not as companions, but as commodities, raised to die. Archaeologists uncovering cat necropolises have found hundreds of thousands of tiny mummified bodies. Many were young, undernourished, hastily wrapped. Some bore signs of deliberate killing, necks broken, skulls crushed. These were not pets memorialized in grief. They were products of a spiritual industry. Even here, exploitation wore the mask of piety. This blending of belief and brutality formed a pattern that echoed across centuries. Cats were not just animals, they were symbols. And symbols can be twisted, in one moment, sacred, in the next, scapegoats. By the close of the ancient world, cats had achieved something unusual. They had spread across continents, not through conquest, but by tolerance, not by force, but by presence. They had been spared, then sacrificed, protected, then skinned, loved and hunted, rare and overabundant. This tension would never fully resolve, not in the centuries to come, not even today. Cats had entered the human story without invitation. They stayed without asking. And now, as the ancient world cracked beneath the weight of empire and belief, the feline remained aloof, observing, and still very much alive. The feline presence lingered, not just in temples or alleyways, but in the tension between reverence and exploitation, in the spaces humans had carved for themselves, and the quiet margins cats had chosen instead. How do we find meaning in what is not there? Unlike Egypt, with its lavish depictions and detailed mummifications, ancient Mesopotamia gives us only whispers of the cat. Not its roar, not even a full breath. The lands of Sumer, Akkad, and later Babylonia left behind a staggering wealth of documentation, cuneiform tablets, trade records, law codes, and mythic epics etched into hardened clay. Yet among these thousands of lines, there is no clear, singular celebration of the cat. This absence is not evidence of insignificance. It is a riddle in plain sight. One theory is that cats simply did not attain cultural visibility in the same way in Mesopotamia. They were there. That much we know from limited faunal remains in sites like Uruk and Nippur, long bones, teeth. A few small skeletons discarded near refuse layers or tucked into domestic architecture. But they exist as biological fact, not as symbolic entities. In Mesopotamian myth, other animals take center stage. The lion, for instance, was revered as a creature of royal strength and divine authority. Gods like Ishtar are flanked by great lions, not house cats. The bull, the serpent, even the scorpion all find their way into the epics and omens. But the quiet, slinking cat remains outside the literary spotlight. What should we make of this selective visibility? Perhaps it is precisely because cats were not grand, not monstrous, not divine, in the epic sense. They did not tear down cities or drag chariots of the gods. They crept through granaries and wove through market stalls. Their presence was local, intimate, and unrecorded by the monumental lens of empire. Still, not all is silence. Some fragments point to a different kind of attention. A broken tablet from Sippar contains an instructional list for a student scribe. Among the many words to be copied, one entry stands out. The Akkadian Piru, translated loosely as wildcat or leopard, but the classification is uncertain. This is the problem with language in deep time. Words shift, categories blur. Was Piru a large predator or simply a misunderstood name for a smaller feline? Elsewhere, in Oman literature, animals are described crossing the threshold of a house. A cat, if it enters from the north and does not leave, could be a warning, or a blessing, or both. Interpretations depend on the scribe, the direction of the wind, and the placement of the stars. The ambiguity is not a flaw, it was the system. And still, this does not tell us how people felt, how they watched the feline form move through shadow, how they responded to its silence, its eyes that seemed to see something more. The silence around cats in Mesopotamian records is not a void. It is a texture, one shaped by dust, climate, custom, and the selective memory of scribes. In Mesopotamia's cities, life was ordered by clay. Every law, trade deal, omen, and hymn was pressed into tablets and stored in libraries or buried in archives. Yet the mundane, what happened in kitchens, in doorways, or behind woven reed screens often escaped record. Domestic life left behind pottery shards, ash, and footprints, not epic poems. The details of daily life were largely unwritten. They lived and died outside the scribal gaze. It is in this quiet archaeological layer that cats likely thrived. Their bones appear near hearths and refuse pits. They show signs of scavenging, of feeding on human waste, and likely on the rodents that flocked to the same grain stores as in the Fertile Crescent. Just as they had in Ain Malaha, they hovered on the edge of human life. Present, useful, tolerated, but not named. Their lives were woven into the rhythms of the home, invisible but essential. But there are moments, brief flickers that suggest a more nuanced presence. At Tel Asmar, a single figurine crudely carved from baked clay shows what appears to be a small quadruped with pointed ears and a curving tail. It lacks the grandeur of lions. It is too slight to be a dog. Its tail curls close to its body, a posture familiar to anyone who has watched a cat at rest, half alert. No inscription marks it, no god's name claims it, but it exists. It speaks with its silence. Someone took the time to make it. Perhaps it sat on a household shrine. Not divine, not sacred, simply present. Perhaps it was made by a child. Perhaps it represented something private, a household spirit, a guardian of the storehouse, an echo of the night. In Mesopotamian cosmology, animals often embodied omens or held symbolic weight in divination practices. Birds and goats had meanings. So did frogs and snakes. Even the appearance of a mouse could be used to interpret the outcome of a harvest. That cats were sometimes folded into these patterns, though rarely suggests they were not invisible, just hard to define. They were not divine, but they were not insignificant either. This difficulty itself might explain the lack of literary celebration. Cats do not herd, they do not fight wars, they do not bleed easily into the metaphors of empire. They refuse commands, yet impose their presence. This quality, subtle and persistent, might have aligned them not with gods or heroes, but with things unknowable. In a culture that feared and revered signs, a creature that neither obeyed nor announced itself could have inspired caution. And yet, they stayed. The more we look beyond monumental art and elite tombs, the more we find traces of quiet coexistence. Hair impressions on textile fragments, scratch marks in mud brick walls, tiny bones found beneath clay ovens. All of it speaks not of reverence, but of rhythm. The rhythm of the cat was not written in tablets. It was traced in the soot, in the edge of lamplight, in the soft pad of feet crossing cool stone in the dark. It is the archaeology of absence, but not unimportant. Absence, in archaeology, is rarely empty. It resists interpretation. It forces us to listen to what is not said. In Mesopotamia, the cat story is whispered from the periphery of the dominant narrative, not carved into ziggurats or sung in royal hymns. Yet the very nature of this silence offers insight into the deeper cultural patterns of a world that categorized everything it encountered. When we turn to the royal menageries of kings and warlords, we see animals transformed into political tools. Lions were paraded, conquered, and slaughtered in ritual hunts that declared royal dominance over the wild. Dogs were shown as hunting companions or symbols of loyalty. Horses pulled chariots and thundered into battle. But cats, small, solitary, and indifferent to spectacle, evaded such pageantry. They did not perform for kings. They did not carry goods or guard thresholds. They simply watched. This quality, the watchfulness, recurs in fragments of Sumerian proverbs. One clay tablet, broken at the edges, includes a phrase that has puzzled translators for decades. It reads, roughly, "The small one sees, though she does not stir." Some scholars argue it refers to a child. Others believe it speaks of a thief. But a newer interpretation proposes it might describe a cat. If so, it is one of the earliest surviving textual nods to the animal's essence. Observant, quiet, unmoved. In the homes of commoners, we must imagine cats less as symbols and more as presences. They moved across rooftops at night, curling into storage alcoves, following the scurry of rats beneath granaries. Children likely knew them well. Women working at grinding stones or weaving probably tossed them scraps or shooed them gently from baskets. Their place was neither divine nor despised. It was something quieter, embedded. Even in the few artistic depictions that may hint at domestic cats, their portrayal is distant. A faded wall painting from a merchant house in Lagash includes a scene of a kitchen. Amid the jars and ovens is a small, arched shape with two upright ears. The pigment is faint, the line work crude, but if it is a cat, it suggests something intimate, an acknowledgement, not a celebration. a background detail of daily life. This invisibility complicates our understanding of ancient urban ecology. It also challenges the traditional view of domestication as something humans do to animals. In the case of the cat, especially in Mesopotamia, domestication seems to have occurred without ritual, ceremony, or written record. It happened slowly, without need for laws or temples. It unfolded in shared space. By the time cats appear more clearly in the historical record sculpted, named, venerated, the foundation had already been laid in places like Ur and Eridu, not in palaces, but in alleyways, not in myths, but in middens. The legacy of those early urban cats lives not in clay tablets, but in behavior passed down. Habits shaped by countless quiet nights, under oil, lamps, and starlight. They watched, and we allowed them to stay, and somehow that was enough. Some feline lineages chose another path entirely, stepping back into the grasses rather than curling beside the hearth. This divergence was not dramatic, it was quiet. A whisker's turn at a crossroads that had no signs. While some wildcats began drifting closer to human life, drawn by the hum of settlements, the warmth of fires, and the promise of easy prey, others remained in the margins. They watched from the shadows, but never crossed the invisible boundary. Not all wildcats wanted what humans offered. Some refused the village altogether. These holdouts belonged to Felis libica, the same species from which domestic cats would later emerge. But even as a few individuals slipped through the narrowing gap between wild and tame, most of their kin stayed wild. In North Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, and parts of Central Asia, populations of Felis libica continued to roam the open savannas, rocky hills, and dry riverbeds. They lived among thorn scrub and stone, where the presence of humans meant danger, not safety. They were ghosts in the tall grass. Their resistance to domestication left a subtle but clear mark. Genetic studies show that domestic cats descend from a limited lineage of Middle Eastern wildcats, likely drawn into commensal relationships by the abundance of rodents in Neolithic settlements. But the rest of the species remained unchanged, evolving along separate paths. In archaeological sites across Libya, Algeria, and Sudan, bones of these wildcats turn up without signs of human contact. No burial, no collar, no figurine. They are just bones, and bones do not purr. Even in regions where humans built granaries and cities, the wildcats often held their distance. Some may have hunted rodents at the fringes of fields, but retreated before sunrise. Others avoided humans entirely, sticking to ranges where hunting was harder but solitude was guaranteed. In some cases, their refusal may have been enforced. Dogs, ferrets, and hawks were preferred pest controllers in certain regions. Cats were sometimes seen as ill omens, their nocturnal habits suspicious. Where the human gaze turned hostile, wildcats kept away. And yet the story is not one of complete separation. Over time, feral domestics began to escape into the wild, mingling with these untamed relatives. Modern conservationists in North Africa warn of the slow erosion of the genetic integrity of true wildcats. Hybrids are difficult to distinguish. Their pelts blur the line between patterned and plain. Their behavior shifts between skittish and bold. The gene pools swirl. To this day, a wildcat might share territory with its tamer cousin, never acknowledging the link. Two faces of the same species, divided by millennia of subtle decisions. Not every animal sought the fire. Some remained at the threshold, paws silent on the dust, choosing their own dusk-bound kingdom. Still, the threshold was not fixed. It shifted with climate, culture, and time. In the Zagros Mountains, near the boundary of Mesopotamia and Persia, communities rose with patterns unlike those of the Fertile Crescent. Here too people stored grain, and here too rodents followed. But the cats who hovered near the Zagros were often different in attitude. They were not the early followers of village life. They remained watchful. Sometimes they were tolerated for their usefulness. At other times, they were chased away. Some were neither feared nor embraced. They were simply there, like the rocks or the wind. This ambiguity created something unique. Not domestication, but familiarity without possession. People knew the wildcats by their eyes, glowing at dusk near the food stores. Children may have thrown them scraps. Elders may have spit to keep them away. These were not pets. They were presences. Seen, sometimes acknowledged, rarely invited in. They were part of the margins, never quite inside the circle of firelight. In Egypt, cats would eventually become sacred. In Europe, they would become familiars and companions. But in the highlands and dry plains of Central Asia and North Africa, Felis libica held its ground. In these places, to be wild was not to be broken. It was to be whole. Human settlements came and went. Fields flourished, then failed. But the cats endured without changing much at all. They learned to read the human world without being consumed by it. Archaeologists digging in southern Morocco have uncovered stone enclosures dated to 4,500 BCE. Within them, remnants of barley, lentils, and millet suggest storage. Gnawed seeds and tiny rodent bones hint at infestation, but no cat bones lie within the structure. Instead, tracks in the surrounding earth tell the rest. Paw prints, preserved in hardened mud, circle the perimeter. The cat came, but it did not enter. It hunted from the edge. In genetic terms, this means something significant. The cats that did not integrate were left out of the domestication process. They passed on genes suited to solitude, not symbiosis. Traits that made a cat more suspicious, less vocal, or more nocturnal might have helped them avoid human attention. Over thousands of years, these behaviors became biology. These wild cats are still out there, alive today, physically similar to domestic cats but behaviorally distinct. They do not meow for food. They do not play with string. They vanish at the snap of a twig. This separation was not antagonistic. It was mutual disinterest. Humanity did not press the issue in these zones. The cats, for their part, had no reason to adapt. The land provided enough. Grain stores were raided by other creatures. Raptors and snakes controlled pests too. The need for a feline alliance never emerged. So, for much of the ancient world, the cat stood poised at the edge of human history. Not inside, not entirely outside. Just there, watching, choosing. Somewhere on the cusp of dawn, a single paw pressed into the soft loam outside a village wall. It was not the paw of a house cat, nor the stride of something tame. It moved without urgency, without fear. This was the descendant of wild bloodlines, unchanged, undomesticated, and unworried. These cats, especially in North Africa and Central Asia, were born to exist in the liminal space, not fully of the human world, not entirely apart from it. Across the Anatolian plateau, records thin out. No murals of sleek felines, no carved statues, just small, unremarkable bones scattered in midden heaps, mixed with hair and mouse remains. These are the ghost records of wild cats who hunted rodents but didn't linger, cats who came with the night and left before morning. There is something deliberate in their absence, not a rejection by humans, but a mutual decision, a non-binding treaty of non-interference. Later, when formal agriculture expanded into colder climates, the lines of interaction changed again. Settlements along the Danube and into the Carpathians showed only faint signs of cats. Perhaps because the cold pushed rodents underground. Perhaps because early human economies had shifted focus. Whatever the cause, the feline silhouette faded from the archaeological lens, and yet the wildcat itself persisted. In the DNA of modern Felis libica, distinct clades still mirror this ancient divergence. One cluster spread with people. It softened, adapted, and eventually became the domestic cat. Another cluster remained in place. It bore no markers of human selection, no coat mutations, no behavioral taming. These cats are still wild today, living in dry hills and rocky crags from the Sahara to the Caspian Sea. This persistent parallel is unlike the story of other animals. Sheep became dependent. Dogs changed skull shape and gut chemistry. Even pigs, fierce as they can be, were reshaped by the hand of humanity. But not the cat. Not entirely. It split its identity. 1 foot inside, 1 foot out. This duality creates tension in the modern myth of domestication. We like clean narratives. Wild becomes tame, animal becomes pet. But the cat denies that. It invites complication. It accepts food without surrendering autonomy. It lives in homes, yet slips away for days. It rubs affection against your leg and vanishes an hour later into alleyways or trees. The ancestors of this behavior are not imagined. They are visible in the fossil record and in modern biology. They trace back to those who hovered at the margins, those who never crossed the threshold. They were not inferior. They were not forgotten. They simply did not need us. Their lineage remains unbroken. Even now, conservationists tracking wildcat populations must distinguish them carefully from feral cats. One has known the human world and retreated. The other never entered it at all. In their eyes there is no dependence. Only calculation, curiosity, restraint. They remain, still, at the edge, silent, watching, choosing. The story of cats on the Nile, of reverence carved into temple walls and wrapped in linen for eternity, might seem like the apex of feline companionship, but the story did not unfold along a single path. There were other landscapes, colder and darker, where feline destinies diverged, and the relationship with humans never reached sacred ground. How do we explain the paths not taken, the feline companions that never crossed the threshold into our homes or our myths? To understand this, we must turn away from the warmth of the Fertile Crescent and the shimmer of the Mediterranean world. We must journey north and west into the wooded expanse of prehistoric Europe. Here, in the shadows of fir trees and the silence of frost-laced grass, lived Felis sylvestris, the European wildcat. Similar in stature to its African cousin, this cat shared much of its DNA with Felis libica. Its form was familiar, its instincts were not. Genetic evidence tells us that, although these species sprang from a common ancestor, their divergence began over 1 million years ago. While Felis libica learned to live near human campsites and later village edges, Felis sylvestris took a different route. It adapted to solitude, to a world of leaves and snow, not firelight and grain. The rhythm of its life was not shaped by human activity, but by the seasonal rise and fall of rodent populations and the quiet passage of prey through thickets. Unlike the African wildcat, it showed little of the behavioral plasticity required to thrive alongside humans. It was not curious about us. It did not linger near the warmth of hearths or the smell of leftover food. Instead, it watched from afar and vanished when approached. This was not hostility. It was indifference, perhaps even wisdom. Archaeological traces reinforce the distinction. In prehistoric sites from France to Poland, bones of Felis sylvestris do appear, but never in ways that suggest companionship. No ceremonial burials. No deliberate arrangements. No carvings in clay. The bones lie among refuse or scattered alone, with no human prints nearby. These were not pets, nor pests. They were ghosts on the edge of the human record. Still, contact occurred. In certain Iron Age settlements, particularly in Central Europe, scientists have uncovered bones with hybrid markers, cats that were neither fully Felis libica nor Felis sylvestris. These were likely the result of ancient crossings, moments when wandering domesticated cats met their wild cousins in the forests or field margins. But these moments were fleeting. The hybrid lines did not flourish. They left no legacy in modern genomes. This quiet divergence between those who joined us and those who did not shapes the feline world to this day. One lineage curled into human laps, the other remained among the roots and rocks. It is not a failure, it is a parallel success. In silence, in solitude, the European wildcat walked a different road. Let us follow its tracks. The European wildcat, unlike its more adaptable cousin, maintained its sovereignty across millennia. But its isolated independence was not the only story unfolding across Eurasia. In the crisscrossing web of trade routes and migratory patterns, human movement was reshaping the continent. And with that movement, some feline populations were slowly drawn into a subtle dance of convergence, resistance, and unintended consequence. As Neolithic farming spread steadily northward and westward from the Fertile Crescent, it brought more than agriculture. Caravans and settlers carried with them grain, livestock, pottery, woven baskets, and all the fragile necessities of early village life. Wherever grain was stored, rodents soon followed, and where rodents thrived, cats often appeared as silent guests. These were mostly the descendants of Felis libica, already familiar with the scent of humanity, the chaos of storage pits, and the predictable rhythms of the village. But their journey met resistance. In the dark pine forests and mist-covered valleys of Europe, another feline stood guard. The European wildcat, Felis sylvestris, was already established. Its territory was fiercely defended, its instincts solitary. It was not curious about these newcomers, nor did it see kinship in them. What followed was a strange ecological encounter. In certain regions, especially in southeastern Europe and parts of the Carpathians, hybridization occurred. These hybrids, born of Libica and Sylvestris, bore traits from both parents. They were experiments written in fur and blood. Some displayed slightly altered skull shapes, others unique coat patterns, but most were behaviorally unstable. They did not possess the trust or tolerance of their Middle Eastern ancestors, nor the elusive cunning of the European wildcats. They were misfits, and the fossil record shows they did not last long. This was not an evolutionary accident, it was a reflection of environmental mismatch. The European wildcat had evolved in densely wooded biomes where stealth and silence were the price of survival. It had no cultural memory of humans, no inherited benefit from proximity to fire, nor any interest in communal warmth. The Libica cats, while flexible, found themselves poorly adapted to cold and dense forests. Their success depended on open plains and easy access to human settlements. Without those, their lineage dimmed. Still, a few hybrid populations persisted into historical times. Genetic research in the 21st century, particularly in the Scottish Highlands and parts of the Balkans, confirmed admixture events. Yet even in those cases, the European wildcat gene pool remained dominant. Conservation efforts today still focus on preserving the purity of Felis sylvestris, a testament to its stubborn lineage. In the vast East, another cat lived untouched. The Pallas's cat, Otocolobus manul, thrived in the cold steppes of Central Asia. No granaries, no villages, no need to change. These varied tales point to a broader truth. Domestication was not universal. It was precise. It was rare. It was not what cats were. It was what a few were willing to become. This divergence between feline species, between the willing and the wild, illuminates a strange truth about domestication. We often imagine it as a path paved by human will, as though people looked at an animal, pointed, and said, "That one." But cats did not march down this path because of human command. In many places, they refused the invitation entirely. The genetic signatures of Felis libica began spreading across Western Asia, the Levant, and North Africa. Their gradual adaptation to human presence, their comfort with the scraps of civilization, offered them a foothold. But outside that narrow belt of temperate village-scattered land, something shifted. In much of Europe, the climate was colder, the forests denser, the human settlements fewer and more transient. Rodents were abundant, but granaries were less consistent. There was little incentive for a cat to hover near people. In these conditions, Felis sylvestris held its ground, and because it did, the idea of the house cat never fully emerged in those regions, at least not until much later, when domestic cats arrived from the south on ships and trade caravans. Until then, the forests remained theirs. It is a reminder that domestication is not a universal trajectory. Dogs, for instance, were actively selected. They were reshaped by human preference, bred and broken to suit tasks, turned from wolves into guards and companions. Their bones tell the story of skulls shortened, teeth rearranged, bodies warped to fit purpose. But cats? Cats were not broken. They were barely bent. They came when it suited them. They lingered where the food was steady and the danger low. And in much of Eurasia, those conditions simply did not exist. Even today, remnants of that resistance survive. In parts of Scotland and Germany, conservationists monitor populations of Felis sylvestris with growing concern. Habitat loss and interbreeding with feral domestic cats now threaten their genetic integrity. But the very need to protect the wildcat's genome is itself a testament. After thousands of years of proximity, this species never truly crossed the threshold. It stood at the edge of the village and watched. Sometimes, in cold winters, it might have crept closer to scavenge, but when spring returned and prey stirred beneath the leaves again, it slipped back into the woods without a sound. This is not a failure of domestication. It is a reminder of boundaries, of what cannot be folded into the human world. Not all animals yearn for warmth and touch. Some guard their solitude-like territory, and they do not give it up lightly. The story of cats in Eurasia, then, is not a single tale. It is a branching tree, one limb coiled into human homes, the other vanished into fog. And in that silence, we find a different kind of bond, not forged in control, but in coexistence, a kind that respected distance, a kind that endured not because it changed the cat, but because it let the wild remain wild. Agriculture's steady expansion carried more than barley and goats. In the wake of tilled soil and clustered homes, another quieter traveller moved. Four-footed, gold-eyed, and nearly invisible to history, cats did not arrive with ceremony. They arrived with grain. Their journey was not announced, and no murals or carved stones celebrated their arrival. But they came anyway. They came because they knew how to listen. They came because they had already learned how to follow the trails humans unwittingly left behind. Our stored seeds and spilled crumbs, our mice and our warmth. They followed patterns older than writing, as human societies spread from the Fertile Crescent into Europe and Asia. Archaeologists have traced their growing shadow not only through tools and pottery, but through the fossil remains of animals once deemed peripheral. At sites like Çatalhöyük in central Anatolia, and later at Vinça in the Balkans, tiny feline bones have surfaced in middens and hearth layers, often dismissed as refuse. But even fragments speak, if arranged carefully. A tooth here, a rib there. Patterns slowly take shape. Wherever granaries took root, rodents followed. Wherever rodents multiplied, a familiar carnivore was not far behind. The archaeological record does not tell a story in bold headlines. It murmurs. It hints. But in the layering of centuries, a shape begins to appear. The map of a migration not by conquest, but by codependence. This trail does not wind through royal palaces or great battles. It hugs the edge of daily life. Cats crept in with cargo and huddled behind fire pits. They curled in the straw beside sleeping infants, hidden from the grand narratives of their time. But they were there, in quiet corners of the Neolithic world, present but unrecorded. By the time agriculture reached the Danube corridor and pressed into the lowest plains of Central Europe, cats had long ceased to be a regional curiosity. They had become ecological hitchhikers. Yet, unlike cattle or dogs, they left few marks of their passage in human art or myth. They were present, but not proclaimed. Their journey was not recorded in bas-relief or carved stele. Instead, they remained behind baskets and under floorboards, crouched between fire and wall. Evidence of their passage remains subtle. In Iron Age Europe, slight changes in bone length, skull shape, and coat coloration hint at slow genetic shifts. The Felis libica lineage had already begun its quiet blending with local wildcats, adapting to colder climates and harder lives. A radius found in a German pit house, a mandible near a lakeside village in Poland. These are not grand discoveries, but they are enough. No caravan listed cats as cargo. No trader etched their names into ledgers. And yet, by the first millennium BCE, they had made the journey. Across mountains and rivers, across languages and tribes. They left no tracks in wet clay. Only a remarkable silence where once there had been rats. But silence in the archaeological record is not the same as absence. Cats do not leave behind bridles or yokes. They do not wear iron shoes or leave hooves etched into stone roads. Their legacy lies instead in absence itself. in the empty granaries no longer chewed through by rats, in the stillness of a pantry undisturbed by squeaking teeth, in the peace of farmers who could finally sleep without the gnawing sound of mice beneath their heads. Across Neolithic Europe, settlements rose near rivers and forests, in valleys of loam and clay. Each new village carried with it seeds, livestock, fire, and habit. And behind all of these came the rodents. Black-eyed thieves with tiny hands and twitching noses. Where humans walked, rodents followed. And behind the rodents came a predator that did not need to be invited. The cat did not ask to come inside. It simply waited, and eventually the door was left ajar. There is something astonishing about this quiet conquest. Unlike horses, which had to be broken, or cattle, which had to be bred, cats shaped themselves to fit around us. They stalked the same rodents we tried to poison. They watched us from rooftops and woodpiles, their motives unreadable. Not every cat stayed. Many lived feral, returning to the forest to breed with wild cousins. But some lingered, and in those liminal spaces, thresholds, hearths, storerooms, another slow transformation began. The spread of cats across Eurasia followed not the bold lines of empires, but the subtle capillaries of trade. Bronze Age exchange routes moved salt, wool, and tin across vast distances. Through these webs of barter and necessity, cats slipped unnoticed. A kitten tucked into a basket of grain. A pregnant female curled in a corner of a wagon. They needed no cages. Their utility was understood. By the late Neolithic, small changes appeared. In sites across modern-day Greece and Italy, cat bones become slightly more gracile, slightly more patterned. Some show signs of healed injury, suggesting they were fed during sickness. A fractured leg that mended, a broken tail with fused vertebrae. These are not pets in the modern sense, but they are more than wild. They are tolerated, perhaps even appreciated. The feline genome tells us the rest. Analysis of ancient DNA reveals that these cats shared ancestry with those in the Levant and Egypt. They were not European wildcats tamed anew. They were travelers, like us. Some interbred with native wild populations, creating hybrids still visible today in forests across France, Hungary, and the Scottish Highlands. But their roots trace back to the sun-baked stones of the Near East. Their spread did not disrupt the world. It soothed it. And in that softness lies a secret. Not all revolutions begin with thunder. Some begin with a pawprint in the dust, a faint shadow flickering across the edge of firelight, a presence not captured in song, but felt in the hush of a home no longer haunted by scratching walls. To follow the cat through prehistory is to follow the whisper of a presence rather than the roar of an event. The domesticated cat, as we now recognize it, never underwent a single explosive transformation. Its journey was not a moment, but a drift. A slow, centuries-long folding into the human world. And by the time that world reached the Atlantic shores of Iberia or the green plains of Britain, the cat had already made itself at home. In the archaeological strata of early European farming cultures, Linear Bankeromic, Bell Beaker, and Urnfield, the evidence remains soft but persistent, not in numbers, not in monuments, but in the occasional anomaly, a small bone in a child's grave, scratch marks in the baked clay of a storage jar, tiny teeth impressions on discarded fish bones. Enough to suggest, though never to confirm, that cats had passed through, that they had watched, that they had stayed. Unlike in Egypt, where cats rose to sacred status, or in Mesopotamia, where their image sometimes peeked through myths, the European relationship remained understated. This was not a continent that deified cats. It simply allowed them. Theirs was not a role of worship, but of function. And perhaps that very ordinariness was the key to their endurance. By the Bronze Age, maritime trade brought faster ships and denser networks of contact. The Mediterranean bustled with movement. Alongside amphorae of wine and wheels of cheese, cats travelled port to port. Crete, Sardinia, Sicily. They passed not as rare goods but as stowaways with purpose. On ships, they were guardians of grain. Their silence was protection. Their hunger, prevention. There is poetic symmetry in the way cats travelled the world to stop something else from spreading. Where mice and rats carried disease and loss, cats carried restraint. In a time before pesticides or steel traps, they were biological insurance. Human settlements expanded and became more complex, from small villages to fortified hilltops, from hamlets to proto-cities. And all the while, cats watched from beneath carts and thatched rooftops, never demanding entry, but never straying far. Their integration into human life came not through control, but through parallel need. We needed someone to keep the rodents at bay. They needed a stable source of food and warmth. Unlike dogs, who looked into our eyes for instruction, cats offered something different: independence without rejection. They were never tamed in the way cattle or goats were tamed. They aligned themselves with us, and in doing so, became indispensable. By the end of the Iron Age, cats had spread across much of the Old World. They arrived before the Romans, before the legions and libraries, before the printing of their names. They were quiet passengers of civilization's great migration, not dragged or herded, but walking alongside, one soft step at a time. In the end, the cat's journey westward was a triumph of stillness. Where most animals were conquered or bred, the cat simply endured. It watched, waited, and in the quiet spaces left by others, it settled, and there it remained. The quiet dispersal of cats across Europe and Asia left few visible traces for the archaeologist's trowel. Bones crumble, stories vanish, and pottery rarely records the pawprint of a predator turned companion. Yet in the slow dance of molecules and inheritance, some echoes survive, not in stone, but in the deep spiral of mitochondrial DNA. In this double helix, coiled tightly in the cell's energy engines, lineages persist. They whisper names of ancestors. They remember migrations. They map the silent journey. But how can we reconstruct an evolutionary path with no roads left behind? Mitochondrial DNA, passed down the maternal line, is both a clock and a compass. Unlike nuclear DNA, which blends with each generation, mitochondrial sequences remain largely intact from mother to daughter. Mutations accumulate slowly, like subtle alterations in a melody passed between singers across centuries. By comparing these variations, scientists can group cats into maternal lineages called clades. These clades form the branches of a tangled but traceable tree. And in that tree, researchers have identified 5 key maternal lineages among domestic cats. They are not fiction. They are measurable, tested, catalogued, and their distribution reveals something astonishing. The lineage known as clade 4, sometimes called the domestic clade, seems to be the genetic beating heart of our house cats. Its roots lie in the Fertile Crescent, most likely among the early agrarian cultures of the Levant. But clade IV does not stay put. As human civilizations expanded, this maternal bloodline followed. It reached Anatolia, then Europe, winding its way into villages, granaries, and eventually port cities. By the time of classical antiquity, this clade was no longer a regional trait. It had become a genetic flag carried by cats from the shores of Spain to the sands of India. More recently, ancient DNA from cat remains in sites across Turkey, Jordan, and Israel, has confirmed what the mitochondrial record long implied. These cats share striking genetic continuity with modern domestics. And intriguingly, one branch of clade 4 split off early, travelling eastward through Iran and into the Indus Valley. Another turned west, riding Roman ships, nesting in Greek colonies, and appearing in medieval European settlements. The pattern is not linear, it zigzags, it doubles back, but the maternal markers hold firm. A different lineage, clade 1, belongs primarily to the European wildcat, Felis sylvestris. This species, while closely related to the African wildcat, did not travel with humans. It remained elusive, solitary, and territorially rigid. Crossbreeding between clade 1 and clade 4 cats has occasionally occurred, especially where feral domestics re-entered forests. Yet their DNA tells 2 different stories, one of opportunism and adaptation, the other of isolation and resistance. To understand these divisions is not only to study cats, It is to ask how life responds to the gravitational pull of human activity, and which species bend, which refuse, which hide inside our homes, and which stay just beyond reach. The mitochondrial echoes do not answer everything, but they make the silence of bones slightly more legible. As the data grew, so did the map. Geneticists, armed with tiny bone samples and high-throughput sequencing machines, began tracing the feline diaspora with greater clarity. What emerged was not a single path of domestication, but a complex braid of movements. The journey of the cat was not one event, it was a network, a web spun slowly through trade, travel, and time. One of the more surprising threads came from ancient Egypt. Long seen as the symbolic cradle of the cat's cultural ascent, it also turns out to be one of the key genetic nodes. Mitochondrial DNA extracted from mummified cats preserved for millennia in desert tombs showed that clade 4 was not alone in Egypt. There, another lineage, clade 3, was also prominent. This suggests something profound. Egypt was not only a spiritual capital for cats, it was a genetic crossroads. Clade 3, though rarer in modern populations, reveals an eastern pull. Its presence hints at feline movement down the Nile, into Nubia, and potentially eastward toward the Red Sea trade routes. From there, cats may have boarded ships bound for the Arabian Peninsula or beyond. And indeed, later sampling in Iran and Western India suggests a subtle but consistent eastern drift. The cat, always quiet, had become an international traveller. Then came the curious case of clade V. Found in limited numbers, this lineage appeared most often in Chinese archaeological contexts. At first, it puzzled researchers. The African wildcat, Felis libica, did not range into East Asia, and the European wildcat, Felis sylvestris, held firm in western forests. So where had these eastern cats come from? The answer, slowly taking shape, points toward a second, independent domestication event. Not from the same ancestors as the Near Eastern lineages, but from a separate Asian wildcat species, Felis sylvestris bieti, the Chinese mountain cat. This animal, rarely seen and highly elusive, may have been the source of domestication attempts in Neolithic China. Grain stores in early Chinese farming settlements drew rodents, and with them, opportunistic cats. Much like in the Levant, a commensal relationship may have emerged, not as successful or widespread, but significant. While most modern domestic cats belong to the Near Eastern lineages, the presence of clade V tells us that the idea of cat companionship was not unique to one region. Humans, across vast distances, came to similar conclusions. They saw in cats a value, a presence that fit into the rhythms of their lives. Mitochondrial data does not tell us everything. It traces only maternal descent. It cannot tell us how cats behaved, how they sounded, or what roles they played in the stories whispered by ancient fires. But it tells us where they were. It tells us how they moved. And it proves that domestication was not a moment. It was a gradient, a shift. And in the unbroken line from ancient mothers to present-day kittens, we hear the past breathing. While mitochondrial DNA helps illuminate the maternal roots of domesticated cats, the broader picture of feline evolution requires a deeper dive into the nuclear genome. Unlike mitochondrial DNA, which follows a single maternal line, nuclear DNA is inherited from both parents. It records complexity. It reflects the mixed decisions of ancestry. It reveals the subtle changes that have taken place over thousands of years in fur texture, behavior, disease resistance, and the long, slow adaptation to human proximity. Through whole genome analysis, scientists have confirmed what archaeology only hinted at. Unlike dogs, which underwent rapid and intentional selection for tasks such as herding, guarding, and companionship, cats changed very little from their wild ancestors. The African wildcat and the modern house cat remain genetically close. More than 95% of their genomes are still identical. The genes that have changed, however, are telling. Mutations affecting memory, fear response, and social behavior began to accumulate in domesticated cats sometime between 7,0 and 5,0 years ago. These mutations did not radically reshape the animal. Instead, they lowered the threshold of tolerance. Wild cats are solitary by instinct. House cats, though often aloof, are capable of living in dense colonies near food sources. They respond to human voices. They recognize names, and they are less likely to flee underfoot or vanish at a sudden sound. This shift was not imposed by humans. It happened quietly, almost invisibly, as more tolerant individuals chose to stay near the warmth of human settlements. One gene in particular, GTF2I, has become a point of interest. In humans, variations of this gene are associated with sociability and anxiety. In cats, the domesticated versions show slight differences from the wild type. Not dramatic, just enough to ease the flight reflex. Enough to stay in the barn instead of the thicket. Enough to pause before running, to watch a child instead of sprinting from their voice. These differences are not easy to see. They live in thresholds, in instincts measured in milliseconds. Such changes echo the broader theme of feline domestication, self-selection. Cats were not bred for tasks. They were not yoked, herded, or broken to a master's will. No harness was ever placed upon them. They domesticated by proximity, by their own criteria. Genetic studies only reinforce this narrative. While humans likely encouraged the presence of cats by leaving scraps, tolerating their nesting, and perhaps even rescuing the occasional injured kitten, the core transformation came from the cats themselves. Another revealing aspect of the genetic record is the relative uniformity among global domestic cats. Despite their broad distribution across continents, most modern house cats descend from the same few maternal lineages, clustered around clade 4. This bottleneck effect suggests that a small founding population, likely from the Levant and Egypt, seeded much of the world's domestic feline gene pool. Later interbreeding with wildcats added variety in coat pattern and local traits, but the genetic foundation remains ancient. And yet, even in this sameness, cats maintain their individualistic streak. No two behave exactly alike. Their independence, written into their evolutionary past, remains encoded in their cells. Domestication, in the feline case, has never been about control. It has been about coexistence, a shared rhythm rather than a hierarchy, a quiet agreement between species, one that continues, even now. Even in the shared rhythm of genes and grain, something essential remained unchanged. The cat never surrendered entirely. It walked at our side, without ever stepping fully into the circle we drew for other animals. So what kind of creature is the cat, really? And what does it mean to live suspended between two worlds? To approach this, we must turn not only to archaeology, but also to ethology, the study of animal behavior. Ethologists observe cats in controlled environments, in feral colonies, and in wild landscapes, mapping their instincts, social structures, and problem-solving abilities. What emerges is a portrait of a species that resists easy classification. Not wholly wild, not wholly domesticated. Both guest and resident. Both partner and stranger. Consider the feral cat colonies that exist today in cities across the globe. These groups provide a living echo of prehistory. When food is plentiful, cats form loose associations. They are not packs like wolves or dogs. They are constellations of tolerance, each individual maintaining its autonomy while orbiting a shared food source. Mothers may share nests. Males may sometimes cooperate in defending territory. But these alliances are provisional, fragile, and shifting. They are built on convenience rather than loyalty or command. This mirrors what scientists believe occurred in the first farming villages. Wildcats lingered near human settlements because rodents were abundant. Over time, tolerance became survival. Yet even now, cats have never relinquished their solitary core. They can live near others, but they do not require them. A cat thrives alone, and when necessary, it thrives together. It moves between modes as easily as it moves between shadow and light. Cognition deepens the paradox. Studies show that cats recognize human voices. They can distinguish between their own name and other sounds. They track the direction of pointing fingers. They anticipate where prey will emerge, using memory and pattern recognition. Yet their responses are not always immediate. A cat may hear and simply choose not to react. It may understand and still decide to remain still. To many people this appears aloof, but in ethological terms it reflects independence. Unlike dogs, who evolved to synchronize with human cues, cats retain the prerogative of choice. Play reveals the same duality. Kittens stalk feathers, chase string, and pounce on toys with uncanny echoes of the hunt. The line between domestic play and predatory practice blurs until it disappears. Even in the safety of a living room, the cat is rehearsing the kill. Its claws extend in silence. Its pupils widen into full moons. In that moment, the household pet becomes the wild hunter again. Thus, the cat embodies both halves. It is soft fur and razor edge. It is affection and indifference. It curls in laps, then vanishes into alleyways. It purrs in the night and hunts in the same breath. No other domestic species retains so much of its wilderness so close to the surface. The cat walks this line gracefully, never choosing, never needing to. To stand at the threshold of wild and domestic is not only to survive, but to thrive in ambiguity. The cat has mastered this balancing act in ways that continue to perplex scientists, owners, and observers alike. It is both the hunter of shadows and the sleeper of hearths. It carries within it a kind of dual citizenship, one paw in wilderness, the other on the woven mat of human life. Ethologists describe this in terms of behavioral flexibility. Most domesticated species were reshaped to fit narrow roles. Dogs were made to herd, guard, or hunt. Cattle were bred for milk or meat. Horses carried riders into war. Cats, however, never bent to such defined purposes. Their usefulness was always indirect. They protected grain not because they were trained to do so, but because their instincts aligned with our needs. They were partners in circumstance, not in obedience. This independence is reflected in their social cognition. When tested in laboratory conditions, cats demonstrate an awareness of human gestures and expressions. They can track a pointing hand, follow the line of a gaze, and even respond to subtle changes in tone. Yet their willingness to act on this knowledge is variable. A dog confronted with the same signals will almost always respond. A cat may, but equally may not. Scientists often describe this as low performance. Perhaps it is better understood as selective attention. The cat chooses. Choice is central to feline identity. Unlike most domesticates, cats retain a high level of self-sufficiency. A dog left to the wild will struggle to adapt, while a cow without human care cannot survive. A cat, however, slips back into ferality with ease. Its body is still tuned to the hunt. Its senses are still sharp enough to stalk, pounce, and kill. The distance between domestic comfort and wild survival is measured in hours, not generations. This is why feral cat populations thrive in urban landscapes, islands, and abandoned ruins. They are reminders that domestication, for cats, was never a full transformation. It was a choice repeated across generations, reversible at any time. The paradox deepens when we examine their relationship to affection. Cats form bonds with humans. Studies show that many display attachment styles similar to those observed in infants and dogs. They seek comfort, follow familiar voices, and display stress when separated from trusted caretakers. Yet they also maintain boundaries. A cat can love, but it can also vanish. It can show deep loyalty and then retreat to solitude. These shifting patterns create a dynamic tension that is both alluring and frustrating to humans. We want certainty. The cat gives us something else. In this ambiguity lies the answer to why cats fascinate us. They resist reduction. They are neither fully ours nor fully other. They walk beside us, yet preserve their own world. The household cat is both a whisper of the African savanna and a warm body curled against the window pane. To see the cat clearly, then, is to accept contradiction. It is an animal that holds two truths at once and forces us to sit with them. This duality is not only biological, but symbolic. For thousands of years, human cultures have projected meaning onto cats precisely because they cannot be pinned down. They are liminal creatures, inhabiting thresholds both real and imagined. In folklore, cats drift easily between roles. In one tale, they are protectors, guardians against evil spirits, or companions of goddesses. In another, they are tricksters, witches' familiars, or omens of death. Their behavior encourages these shifting interpretations. They appear suddenly, vanish silently, stare with unblinking eyes as if they see what we cannot. Their refusal to conform becomes the canvas on which we write our fears and desires. Ethology gives these myths a foundation. The cat's unique style of communication, subtle and often reserved, differs greatly from the eager signalling of dogs. Cats communicate with a narrow vocabulary of meows, purrs, and trills sounds that are often directed more at humans than other cats. Eye blinks, tail flicks, and ear positions form a language that is quiet but precise. To live with a cat is to learn this hidden script. It is a relationship built not on command, but on interpretation, a dialogue of patience. And yet, even as we decode these signals, the mystery deepens. Cognitive studies reveal that cats are capable of complex problem-solving. They can open doors, manipulate objects, and navigate mazes with surprising efficiency. Some learn through observation, watching a human perform an action and then replicating it. Yet these skills are often hidden, displayed only when useful. Unlike dogs, who often perform for approval, cats conceal as much as they reveal. Their intelligence is not a show. It is a private tool. This privacy may be the essence of their allure. They live with us, but they are not of us. A cat resting on a windowsill seems at home, yet its gaze falls beyond the glass, fixed on movements in the grass or shadows in the air. It belongs partly to our world, partly to one we cannot enter. This in-between state is not a flaw of domestication. It is its defining feature. To call cats half-domesticated is accurate in a technical sense, but perhaps misleading. They are not incomplete versions of what we wish them to be. They are complete in themselves. They are animals that negotiated the terms of coexistence on their own. They chose proximity without surrender, cooperation without obedience. Few species have managed this balance. Fewer still have maintained it for millennia. And so, the cat remains a creature between worlds. The hunter and the companion. The solitary and the social. The untamed and the trusted. Its presence reminds us that domestication is not always domination. Sometimes it is a truce. Sometimes it is an agreement whispered in the night, marked by a slow blink and sealed by silence. To call the cat a creature between worlds is to recognize its dual nature, yet nowhere is that duality more vivid than in the night. When humans closed their eyes to rest, the cat opened its own wider. In the dim glow of firelight, one species slept while the other began its shift. What did it mean for prehistoric people to sleep beside a creature that hunted while they dreamed? The fire was both comfort and barrier. Its warmth kept the chill at bay. Its glow pushed back the shadows, but no flame could erase the dark entirely. Beyond the circle of light, the world stirred. The crack of twigs, the shuffle of paws, the rustle of wings. Prehistoric nights were layered with sounds, many of them unknowable. To lie down and surrender to sleep was, in a sense, to surrender to trust. The family, the group, the fire itself, all offered protection. And then, in time, so did the cat. Ethologists tell us that cats are crepuscular, most active in the hours just before dawn and after dusk. This rhythm suited the early village well. Humans, tired from the labour of grinding grain, hauling water, or shaping tools, fell into rest at sundown. Cats awoke then, slipping into motion. Their silent patrols were not for people. They were for mice, rats, and the small prey that came to life when humans fell quiet. But for the sleepers, the effect was profound. To wake and find the food store intact, unspoiled by gnawed husks or droppings, was to feel an unseen ally at work. We cannot know whether early people thought of cats as guardians. but we can imagine the reassurance. To see eyes glowing beyond the fire, not of wolves or hyenas but of smaller, familiar companions, must have altered the emotional weight of the night. The cat was not a domesticated guard like the dog. It did not bark warnings. Yet its presence shifted the balance of the unseen. It was a reminder that the darkness was not only danger, it also held protectors. Archaeological traces hint at this role in subtle ways. In sites dated to the Neolithic, storage pits show reduced signs of rodent damage, where cat bones also appear. The connection is circumstantial, but the inference is strong. A cat active at night meant fewer pests. Fewer pests meant more secure food. More secure food meant survival. The nocturnal habits of the cat intertwined, without plan, with the sleeping habits of people. There is also the symbolic layer. Human dreams, then as now, were filled with creatures. To dream by the fire, while a cat padded silently nearby, is to blur the line between vision and reality. The cat, half wild, half familiar, became part of both worlds, the waking and the dreaming. It was a companion not only of daylight labor, but of the unguarded hours, the fragile moments when breath slowed and the mind wandered into mystery. To imagine the prehistoric night is to imagine vulnerability. The crackling of fire was never absolute. Beyond the light, predators prowled, insects buzzed, and the air itself seemed alive with tension. Sleep was not simple. It was surrender. Yet within this fragile exchange, the cat carved out its niche. It was a nocturnal sentinel, not by loyalty, but by instinct. Ethology helps us reconstruct this partnership. Cats possess extraordinary night vision. Their eyes contain a reflective layer, the tapetum lucidum, which doubles the available light. What to humans was impenetrable dark was, to cats, a muted twilight. They could see the trembling of whiskers in the grass, the flick of a mouse tail beneath scattered chaff, the faintest stir of life in shadows. Where our ancestors closed their eyes, cats opened theirs wider. One species dreamed, the other hunted. This nocturnal rhythm intertwined with human survival in ways rarely written down but deeply felt. Grain was life. To lose it was to starve. Rodents, breeding quickly and moving unseen, threatened that stability. A single night of unchecked gnawing could mean weeks of hunger. The presence of a cat reduced this threat not through planning, but through its natural cycle. While humans slept, cats stalked the thieves. Their silent labor turned the village night into something more secure, but the impact may have gone beyond the granary. Consider the psychology of sleep. Even in modern contexts, people rest more easily when they feel protected. Dogs, in later millennia, would serve as barkers of alarm. Cats, though voiceless in warning, may still have offered reassurance. To glimpse those glowing eyes beyond the fire was to know that some watchful presence was awake. Not all silence was emptiness. Some silence was vigilance. This quiet guardianship may also explain the dual symbolism cats have carried for millennia. They are creatures of shadow, associated with mystery, magic, and even danger. Yet they are also companions, guardians of the home, keepers of balance. This paradox likely began here, in the firelit nights of early villages. Cats were neither fully inside nor outside the circle. They belonged to the darkness, but lingered close enough to be known. They were never harnessed, never tied, but they remained. Archaeological echoes suggest that this presence became habitual. In multiple Neolithic sites, hearths and storage pits are found in close association with feline remains. These may have been chance burials. Yet they may also reflect a recognition that cats belonged to the domestic sphere, even if they walked at its margins. They were not livestock, but they were not strangers either. They were liminal residents of the night, integrated by action rather than by ritual. To sleep beside such a creature was to share vulnerability with something both wild and familiar. It was to know that while the human body drifted into dreams, another hunter walked the threshold of the dark. And in that trust, unspoken, the seeds of companionship deepened. The cat's companionship at night was not forged in ceremony, but in repetition. Each evening, when humans folded into slumber and the fire dwindled, the feline remained. It stretched, yawned, and stepped into the darkness with pupils wide, whiskers forward, and muscles primed. Its patrols, silent and tireless, stitched the hours between dusk and dawn. And as centuries passed, this rhythm became a familiar pattern, a subtle promise woven into the fabric of human life. Ethological studies today give us glimpses of what those nights must have felt like. Domestic cats retain their nocturnal and crepuscular tendencies, often pacing houses when their owners sleep. Their energy peaks in the hours when humans are least aware. Even in comfort, they rise to hunt shadows on walls, to listen to hidden sounds, to pounce on moving dust. These behaviors, often seen as quirks of modern pets, are echoes of ancient survival. They remind us that long before toys dangled on strings, cats honed their skills in storerooms and fields, where the stakes were hunger and survival. For prehistoric people, this was more than convenience. It was an unseen contract. The food stores remained safe, not through intention but through alignment of cycles. One species dreamed, the other hunted. One depended on fire for security, the other embraced the dark. Together, they formed a partnership more profound than words could record. There may also have been awe. To watch a cat vanish beyond the firelight and return with prey must have felt uncanny. It slipped easily between the visible and the invisible. Its eyes reflected flames like twin lanterns in the dark, as if carrying a spark of the fire itself into the night. Such images linger. They feed myth. They shape stories whispered around embers. Perhaps cats were seen as guides through shadow, mediators between the human camp and the wilderness pressing in. The symbolism of cats as liminal beings associated with magic, mystery, and the unseen likely took root here. Their ability to thrive in darkness marked them as different. Not threatening, like wolves or hyenas, but uncanny. Not entirely ours, but not entirely wild either. This in-betweenness shaped cultural imagination. The cat was never just an animal. It was a presence, an emblem of the night made visible. Archaeological silence leaves us with only fragments, bones in refuse pits, the faint outline of claws etched into clay. Yet when we pair these with behavioral continuities, the picture sharpens. The same instincts that animate modern cats animated their ancestors. The same midnight wanderings, the same unblinking gaze. These continuities bridge the gulf between the Neolithic hearth and the living room floor. They remind us that the feline's nocturnal labour is one of the oldest forms of companionship we know. To dream beside such a creature was to trust in a rhythm deeper than language. To awaken and find the food untouched, the fire rekindled, and the eyes still watching was to know that survival was not a solitary act. It was a shared vigil, kept in silence, written in the glow of firelight, and carried forward in the shimmer of a cat's eyes at night. To dream beside a creature that kept its own vigil was to feel a quiet protection. Yet, protection is not possession. And perhaps the most radical truth in the long history of cats is this: they walked with us freely, without chains. How did companionship arise when control was never imposed? Most domestic species were shaped through mastery. Oxen were fitted with yokes, bound to ploughs, and bred for strength. Dogs were leashed, collared, and taught commands. Horses were broken, their wildness trained out through harness and rein. These animals entered the human world by force, through structures of control. Their usefulness depended on obedience. Cats defied this model. They were never tethered, never yoked, never truly commanded. Their relationship with us began without coercion. The earliest evidence of this partnership is found in the small gestures of tolerance. A wildcat that lingered near a granary, a farmer who chose not to chase it away. Over time, these moments stacked upon one another. The cat was not pulled into the circle of firelight. It stepped into it, cautiously, of its own accord. That choice is crucial. It reframes domestication not as an act of domination, but as a mutual agreement. One species allowed, the other accepted. This arrangement required something unusual: patience. For humans accustomed to bending animals to their will, the cat represented a different model. It could not be bent. It would not haul burdens, or stand guard at command, or provide milk or wool. What it offered was indirect. A reduction of rodents, a presence that made food stores safer, and perhaps, in time, companionship. But this was never guaranteed. The cat gave what it chose to give. That unpredictability is precisely what makes the bond radical. Ethology reinforces this narrative. Cats retain all the physical and cognitive traits necessary for survival in the wild. Their hunting instincts remain intact. Their bodies, agile and solitary, remain unaltered by the demands of labor. Even today, feral cats can thrive without human care, slipping back into the rhythms of predation as if no centuries of coexistence had passed. Few other domestic species hold this independence so closely. The cat is never fully ours. It remains, in part, its own. This independence did not weaken the relationship. It strengthened it. By living alongside an animal that could leave at any moment, humans entered a new kind of companionship, one based on respect rather than control. To live with a cat was to accept uncertainty, to accept that its affection might arrive unbidden and vanish just as quickly. This required humility, an acknowledgement that not all animals could be mastered. Some could only be welcomed. The radicalism of this arrangement often goes unrecognized, yet it shaped the cat's place in our history. By refusing chains, the cat offered a new model of partnership, one that began in prehistory, by firelight and granary, and continues still whenever a cat curls at our feet, not because it must, but because it chooses. The choice of the cat to remain unbound reshaped not only human expectations of animals, but also our imagination of what partnership could be. A dog on a leash could be trusted to follow. An ox beneath a yoke could be forced to pull. A horse under rein could be directed across battlefields or fields, but the cat could only be trusted if it wanted to be. Its loyalty was conditional, its presence voluntary. This conditionality was not weakness, it was a new kind of power. Archaeological evidence reflects this quiet autonomy. In burials across Cyprus and the Levant, cats are found interred beside humans, yet their bones bear no marks of restraint. They show no signs of forced breeding, no alterations of form that suggest they were shaped for a task. Instead, they remain close to their wild ancestors in size, limb proportion, and dentition. The implication is striking. These cats lived near humans, close enough to be buried with them, yet they retained their wildness. The partnership did not erase the animal, it acknowledged it. This acknowledgement required a shift in the human mind. To accept a cat into one's home or settlement was to accept unpredictability. The cat might curl beside the fire, or it might vanish into the night for days. It might stalk rodents with perfect efficiency, or it might spend hours sunning itself on a roof beam. In all cases, its usefulness was never absolute, and still people kept them near. This suggests that something more than utility was at work. Perhaps it was admiration. Watching a cat hunt is to witness elegance, the stillness before the pounce, the sudden burst of speed, the precision of the strike. Such behaviors, once observed around early villages, may have inspired not only practical relief, but aesthetic awe. Humans are drawn to beauty in motion. The cat offered that freely. It was not bred for labor, but it embodied grace, independence, and mystery. These qualities carried value of their own. Ethological research today echoes these prehistoric impressions. Cats respond to human affection, but only within their chosen boundaries. They form attachments, but they are not submissive. They can be affectionate without being obedient, playful without being trained, loyal without being commanded. This model of relationship, founded not on dominance but on negotiation, is radical when compared to most other domesticates. It is as if the cat forced humanity to accept a new grammar of companionship, one defined not by what we could demand, but by what we were given. This grammar continues to shape our view of cats today. We speak of them as mysterious, aloof, independent. We accept their refusal to come when called, their selective affection, their sudden withdrawals. Rather than diminishing them, these qualities make them more compelling. They remind us that partnership need not be absolute to be real. that chains are not required for closeness, that trust can be built not by force, but by freedom. To live with an animal that could not be commanded was to step into a different kind of relationship. It was less about training than it was about trust, less about ownership than it was about coexistence. And in this quiet exchange, humans may have discovered something profound about the very idea of companionship. Unlike oxen, horses, or dogs, cats never became extensions of human labor. They were not beasts of burden or soldiers in war. They were not harnessed to fields or chained to gates. They walked their own path, and yet that path often ran parallel to ours. The freedom of the cat was part of its gift. It offered its presence without coercion. It stayed not because it had to, but because it chose to. For prehistoric people, who lived in a world where control over animals often meant survival, this would have been a revelation. Not everything needed to be bound to be valuable. Not every bond had to be enforced. There is an intimacy in this acceptance. To allow another creature to remain itself, and to still welcome it, is a form of respect. The cat carried its wilderness into the village, and was not stripped of it. That wildness never fully left. Even now, in modern homes, a domestic cat crouches at the window, pupils wide, tail twitching, watching birds in the trees as if it had never known a roof. The ancient arrangement remains alive. We accept their wildness, and in return, they share their nearness. The radical idea that true companionship does not require control can be traced to this partnership. Cats reveal to humans that relationships could be mutual, voluntary, and fragile, yet still enduring. This insight would ripple outward. In art, cats became symbols of independence, grace, and mystery. In myth, they occupied the liminal spaces between wild and tame, day and night, sacred and ordinary. They reminded us that the world was not only what we shaped, but also what we allowed. Archaeological silence on leashes or cages speaks louder than their absence. We find bones, we find burials, we do not find collars from prehistory. This absence suggests a simple truth. Cats were never tethered. Their cooperation could not be demanded. It had to be invited, and somehow it was enough. Humans offered food, warmth, and proximity. Cats offered vigilance, elegance, and presence. Both species benefited, neither surrendered. This model still resonates. Even in a modern apartment, a cat may curl against a sleeping human, not because it is commanded, but because it wills it. It may leave the next moment, vanish into another room, and return at dawn. The rhythm is its own. The partnership endures without chains. It is a reminder, across millennia, that true companionship is not built on mastery, but on the fragile and radical act of choosing to stay. The companionship of cats began in silence. It continued in silence. And for a long stretch of human history, silence is all the record gives us. Between 5000 and 1000 BCE, the story of cats fades into shadow. The archaeological trail that once hinted at their growing presence falters. Their paw prints blur, their bones grow scarce. Their image, so vivid in Egypt, falls away elsewhere. Why does the record grow quiet? And what can silence itself teach us? Absence in archaeology is never meaningless. It is a form of data. The missing is as important as the found. To walk through this long pause in the cat's history is to confront the limits of evidence and the fragility of memory. It is to recognize how the lives of small, ordinary creatures slip beneath the notice of scribes and sculptors, leaving us only scraps from the margins. The years between 5000 and 1000 BCE were not uneventful. They were years of revolution. Farming spread from the Fertile Crescent into Europe and Asia. Bronze was smelted. Settlements grew into towns, towns into cities. Empires rose in Mesopotamia, in Anatolia, in the valleys of the Indus and the Yellow River. The human world was exploding into complexity, yet the cat's voice in this chorus all but disappears. Part of the explanation lies in scale. Cats were small. They left behind little material culture. Unlike cattle, their bones are not found in sacrificial heaps. Unlike horses, they were not buried with warriors. Unlike dogs, They were not painted in hunting scenes. Cats lived at the edges of the human stage. They slipped through doorways, kept to corners, patrolled the night. Their contribution was quiet, and quiet contributions rarely carve themselves into monuments. Another part of the silence lies in perception. To many societies, cats may not yet have achieved the symbolic weight they held in Egypt. They were tolerated, perhaps even welcomed, but not celebrated. Their work catching rodents was vital, yet mundane. Farmers did not record the absence of mice as they recorded the success of harvests. To keep pests away was to maintain balance, not to achieve glory. And so the cat's value, though real, remained invisible to history's pen. Still, traces appear if we look closely. Bones scattered in refuse pits at Anatolian sites, isolated mandibles in Neolithic Europe, faint impressions of claws on clay storage jars. These fragments remind us that silence is not emptiness. The cats were there. They were simply unremarked upon. Their presence blended into the ordinary, and the ordinary is what archaeology most often loses. The long pause, then, is less about absence than about assimilation. Cats had become part of the fabric of daily life, too common to record, too quiet to immortalize. They were folded into the night's rhythm, present in every village, yet vanishing from the official record. And in that vanishing, they reveal a truth. History is shaped not only by what survives, but by what is deemed worth remembering. The silence of the record tempts us to imagine a void. But in truth, life during these millennia was dense with movement. People migrated, traded, fought, and built. In this constant motion, cats surely moved with them, tucked into baskets of grain, prowling through storehouses, curling in shadows. Their presence was not extraordinary, it was ordinary. And perhaps that ordinariness is why they disappeared from sight. Archaeologists speak of taphonomic bias, the way the processes of decay, burial, and preservation distort what survives. Small bones crumble more easily. Cats, with their lightweight frames, vanish faster than cattle or sheep in the soil. What we call absence may in part be erasure. The archaeological silence, then, is not only cultural but geological. The earth swallows the small more readily than the large. The cat was never absent. It was only less likely to leave a mark. Yet silence also reflects choices in human record-keeping. Monumental art celebrated power. Writing recorded kings, trade, and gods. Cats, padding quietly through kitchens, were not given space in these narratives. Even where they were present, they were unrecorded. They belonged to the realm of the everyday. And history, in its earliest forms, was not written for the everyday. It was written for glory. Still, a few faint shadows cut through this long pause. In Mesopotamian omen texts, fragments mention small felines entering homes, their behavior interpreted as signs. A cat that enters from the north is a good omen, one text whispers. A cat that refuses to leave may be ill fortune. These are not depictions of beloved companions. They are glimpses of animals whose movements were watched with suspicion or curiosity, folded into the logic of divination. They remind us that cats were noticed, even if only at the edges of ritual. In Central Asia, traces appear in the form of hybrid bones. Genetic evidence hints at interbreeding between domestic cats drifting out of the Near East and local wildcats. These hybrids rarely endured as lineages, but they testify to contact, to mingling, to cats existing wherever humans carried grain. This is not a story written in temples or statues, but in the quiet interlacing of genes. A faint reminder that the cat's spread never truly stopped, even when history fell silent. Perhaps this silence itself is part of the feline story. The cat has always thrived in ambiguity. It is a creature that resists spectacle. It walks where it will, and it does so without leaving obvious trails. To find cats missing from the grand narratives of 5000 to 1000 BCE is to find them acting in character. They were there, they were vital, but they were unseen. The long pause teaches us something about how history works. Not everything essential is celebrated. Not everything that disappears has vanished. In the silence between monuments, life continues. The cat's absence is not absence at all. It is the proof of survival too seamless to stand out. It is history lived at the threshold, half in shadow, half in firelight. To sit with the silence of the record is to practice humility. We want the cat's story to be continuous, to flow in a clear line from the Levant to the hearths of modern homes. But the truth is more uneven. For nearly 4,000 years, the traces fade. The cat walks beside us, yet vanishes from the documents we carve, the murals we paint, and the bones we arrange. We are left with absence, and absence, too, speaks. Between 5000 and 1000 BCE, the rhythms of human civilization shifted profoundly. Bronze reshaped warfare and trade. New empires rose and collapsed. Vast migrations spread languages and crops across continents. But through all of this, the cat stayed largely invisible in the great stage of record. It remained in the shadows of barns, in the corners of kitchens, in the silence of night. The partnership endured, but quietly. What does this say about the human gaze? Perhaps that we only record what astonishes us. We paint the lion, not the mouser. We carve the ox, not the watcher in the rafters. The cat, folded into the ordinary, was no longer extraordinary. Its very success, its seamless integration into human life rendered it unremarkable. The more common it became, the less it was remembered. Modern archaeology is beginning to close this gap. Advances in genetic sampling now allow us to detect feline DNA in soil layers, even when bones have crumbled. Studies of ancient granaries reveal traces of cat hair, woven invisibly into sediment. These fragments prove what silence long concealed. Cats were there, woven into the fabric of life, even when memory forgot them. The absence was never true absence. It was erasure by familiarity. This paradox is powerful. The cat was indispensable, yet overlooked, present, yet unrecorded. Perhaps this tension is why cats still carry an aura of mystery today. They remind us of what lives just beyond attention, of what persists without inscription. They are creatures that thrive in the spaces history forgets. The long pause also prepares us for what comes after. When the silence lifts, it does so dramatically. By the time we reach the first millennium BCE, cats return to the record in force. In Egypt, they become sacred. In Greece, they enter household life. In Rome, they follow legions and merchants. The absence makes the reappearance all the more striking. It is as though, after centuries of quiet integration, the cat steps into the light, suddenly visible, suddenly recognized. Until then, the pause reminds us to look more closely, to see value in the unremarkable, to remember that history is not only the story of kings and battles, but of the small lives folded into shadows. The cat teaches us this. It was always there, even when no one thought to say so. Its silence was not emptiness. It was endurance. The silence of the long pause teaches us that survival is not always written in monuments. Sometimes it is carried forward in small, ordinary acts. When the record grows faint and the trail of bones thins, we must return to the beginning, back to the earliest villages, to the moment when a wildcat first lingered at the edge of firelight and chose not to leave. What if the defining trait of cats was never domestication, but the decision to stay? In those first settlements, people gathered grain into clay-lined pits. They wove baskets. They piled scraps and husks into middens, and in the darkness, rodents multiplied. It was into this niche that Felis libica stepped, not coerced, not bound, simply present. At first, the relationship was tentative, a flash of fur in the shadows, a pair of eyes glowing at the edge of the fire. Then, over seasons, a pattern emerged. The wildcat returned. It found the village a place worth revisiting. The humans, for their part, tolerated its presence. That fragile tolerance, repeated over years, became the foundation of something enduring. Archaeological finds from sites like Shillourokambos and Ain Malaha remind us that cats lived close enough to be buried beside humans. Their bones show no signs of selective breeding, no evidence of forced labor. They are wild in form, yet intimate in placement. This suggests a relationship built not on ownership, but on coexistence. A mutual agreement, unspoken, forged in the shared rhythm of life. Grain for humans, rodents for cats, security for both. This choice by cats to remain, and by humans not to drive them away, was revolutionary in its simplicity. It asked nothing more than patience. Unlike the dog, whose domestication was accelerated by intentional breeding, or the ox, whose body was reshaped by yokes and ploughs, the cat changed slowly. It shifted not in form but in habit. It learned to stay near, to return often, to raise its young in the safety of human settlements. Each generation that lingered deepened the bond. The story of domestication is less about capture than about persistence, less about ownership than about trust. Ethologists argue that cats are among the few species to have domesticated themselves. They adjusted their behaviors to fit alongside ours. Their meows, distinct from the calls of wildcats, evolved to mimic the pitches of human infants, an adaptation that drew attention and care. Their tolerance of proximity, unusual for solitary hunters, increased with every generation that chose not to flee. The cat became domestic not by force, but by preference. It found value in the village and decided to remain. For humans, this must have been a revelation, that a creature could live among them without chains, without commands, and yet still contribute to survival. It shifted the paradigm of companionship. It taught that not all relationships require control. Some require only patience. And patience, in turn, builds a bond as enduring as stone. To picture the cat's choice is to imagine an ancient scene, simple yet profound. A family sits by the hearth. The air is thick with smoke and the smell of grain. In the shadows, a small hunter waits, not hostile, not tame, watching. Its body is coiled with the tension of the wild, but it does not vanish. It has chosen this place as its hunting ground. It has chosen to return. This act of return may be the essence of domestication. Not the leash, not the cage, not the yoke, simply the decision to remain. Dogs were pursued, pups captured, wolves slowly reshaped through selective breeding. Goats were penned, cattle were tethered, but cats slipped into villages of their own accord. Their domestication was less an act of human will than of feline patience. Over generations, that patience reshaped everything. Archaeologists studying early Neolithic sites notice this difference. Cat bones appear irregularly in refuse, sometimes preserved in burials, sometimes left scattered. They are not numerous, not central, yet their presence is consistent enough to suggest that they were never strangers. They were peripheral residents of these settlements, always nearby, always half visible. It is this constancy, rather than abundance, that marks their significance. They were not bred, they were not counted among livestock, but they stayed. What does it mean to stay when you could leave? The cat could have retreated into the scrublands, as many of its kin did. It could have avoided human scent entirely. Instead, some chose proximity. This choice was not universal. Many wildcats kept their distance, but those that lingered began to alter the balance of life in the village. They reduced rodents. They secured food stores. They became part of the settlement's ecology. They filled a role no one had planned, but one everyone came to depend upon. Humans, for their part, also made a choice. They did not drive the cats away. They allowed them. They tolerated their predation of rodents. They offered scraps, whether intentionally or by accident. They let them breed in the safety of walls and storehouses. This mutual patience, humans not forcing, cats not fleeing, created a bond unique among domesticated animals. It was built not on control, but on coexistence. Ethology supports this picture. Studies of feral cats show that they retain their independence, yet thrive in proximity to humans when resources are abundant. They form colonies not out of loyalty, but out of tolerance. They share space without losing autonomy. This echoes the prehistoric pattern. The first cats that chose to remain were not submitting. They were negotiating. They carved out a space in the village without surrendering their identity. That negotiation became tradition. Tradition became lineage. The great irony is that the cat's defining domestication trait may not be obedience, but persistence. It did not need to be broken. It simply needed to remain, to stay close long enough for patience to bear fruit. And in that act of staying, it wove itself into the human story. The patience of cats and humans, stretched across thousands of years, became a partnership so subtle that it often disappears from the written record. Unlike the ox, whose strength was plain to see, or the horse, whose speed altered empires, the cat's contribution was quiet. It protected not with force, but with vigilance. It did not drag the plough, nor did it bark at intruders. Instead, it lingered in the shadows. It watched from rafters and thresholds. And most importantly, it stayed. This simple act of staying carried meaning that went beyond the practical. It reshaped the way humans thought about animals. To share space without mastery was to discover another form of kinship. The dog had already shown loyalty, but that loyalty was tied to training and command. The cat revealed something else. That coexistence could be born of patience, that the wild could remain wild and still live near the hearth. Archaeological silence during the long pause reminds us how easily this truth was overlooked. The cat's role was not carved into monumental stone nor celebrated in mythic poetry. It was woven into habit. A family woke to find their grain untouched. A child grew accustomed to a striped shadow passing across the doorway. A farmer spared a prowler because he had noticed fewer mice that season. None of these were dramatic events. Yet together, they formed the backbone of a quiet relationship. Each small tolerance, repeated generation after generation, pushed the bond forward. Modern science affirms this picture. Genetic analyses reveal that domestic cats differ only slightly from their wild ancestors. Their bones remain lean, their bodies retain the instincts of solitary hunters. But their behavior shifted. They grew more tolerant of human presence. They meowed more often, evolving vocalizations that resembled the cries of infants, sounds that drew human attention and care. They became less likely to bolt at sudden movement. These were not traits imposed by force. They were traits selected by the cats themselves, as they chose, repeatedly, to remain close to us. This makes the cat unusual among domesticated species. Its path was not marked by reshaping of form or complete dependency. It was marked by choice, by a willingness to remain near while still keeping one paw in the wild. That balance persists today. A cat can curl against a person's leg and still vanish into solitude moments later. It is this freedom within nearness that makes their companionship feel radical, even now. Perhaps this is why cats continue to hold our fascination. They remind us that relationships need not be built on control. They remind us that trust can grow in silence, in small gestures, in the rhythm of survival shared between species. The cat never surrendered its essence. It remained wild at heart, yet chose to stay. That choice, made again and again across millennia, became one of humanity's quietest and most enduring alliances. Thank you, fellow sapiens, for walking this long road with me through the quiet history of companionship, following the cats who crossed water, watched our firelight, and chose to stay beside us. If this story offered you a small warmth, a tilt of wonder, or even a new question to keep in your pocket, then your time here has been a gift. I'm grateful you shared it. What echo will you carry when the screen dims, the word that caught, the silence that spoke, or the image that will not let go? Eyes at the edge of the fire, paw prints circling a clay granary at dawn, a reed boat sliding toward an island with a silent passenger. If something lingered for you, leave it in the comments as a quiet offering to others tracing these paths with us, so we can build this thoughtful little community together. If you'd like to keep traveling, feel free to like, subscribe, or share. More hidden histories and companion species wait just beyond the next bend. Until we meet again, stay curious, stay thoughtful,